Father Marcus had been hearing confessions at St. Catherine's for 23 years, but nothing had prepared him for the voice that whispered through the screen that October evening. The church was empty except for the penitent in the booth beside him, their breathing shallow and erratic. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice began, barely audible. It was a woman's voice, aged and trembling. "It has been so very long since my last confession." Father Marcus adjusted his position, the familiar weight of his vestments suddenly feeling heavier. "Go on, my child. God's mercy is infinite. I killed my daughter 40 years ago." The words hung in the air like incense, thick and suffocating. Father Marcus felt his throat constrict. In all his years, he had heard confessions of adultery, theft, even violence, but this was different. The certainty in her voice, the calm way she delivered such devastating words. "Tell me what happened," he managed, his voice barely steady. "She was 7. Beautiful, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like spun silk, but she was different. She would speak to people who weren't there, tell me things about neighbors that she couldn't possibly know. Dark things, true things." Father Marcus pressed his fingers to his temples. "Children often have vivid imaginations. She told me Mrs. Henderson next door was burying something in her garden at midnight. I laughed it off until the police found her husband's body there 3 days later. She told me the mailman was touching little boys. 2 weeks later, he was arrested. She knew things, Father, terrible things that hadn't happened yet." The confessional suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. Father Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the cramped space. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I convinced myself she was evil, that something dark had taken hold of her. So I put pills in her milk. She went to sleep, and she never woke up. I told everyone it was her heart. She was born with a murmur. No one questioned it." Father Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. "And you've carried this for 40 years? Oh, Father," the woman's voice cracked. "That's not the worst part. She's been visiting me. Every night for 40 years, she comes to my bedside. Still 7 years old, still in that little white nightgown. She doesn't speak anymore, just stands there, watching me with those knowing eyes." The priest's hands began to shake. "Guilt can manifest in many ways. She's not guilt, Father. She's real. And last night she finally spoke. She told me about you." Father Marcus went rigid. "About me?" "She told me about the boy in your last parish. The one who fell down the stairs. The one whose confession you heard the day before he died. She told me what he confessed to you, and what you did about it." The blood drained from Father Marcus's face. Timothy Morrison, 13 years old. He had confessed to Father Marcus that his stepfather was molesting him, begged for help. But the stepfather was a prominent businessman, a major donor to the church. Father Marcus had told the boy to pray, to be patient, that God would provide a solution. Timothy had died that night, tumbling down the basement stairs while trying to escape another assault. "How could she know that?" Father Marcus whispered. "Because she sees everything now, Father. All the children who weren't protected, who weren't believed, who died with secrets. They all talked to her. And she's coming for you tonight." "That's impossible. You're disturbed. You need help." But when Father Marcus looked through the screen, the booth was empty, had been empty. The worn velvet kneeler showed no impression of recent use, and the air held no trace of perfume or human presence. That night, Father Marcus couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old rectory made him start. Every shadow seemed to move. At 3 a.m., he heard it. The soft sound of bare feet on hardwood floors. He pulled his blankets over his head like a child, but the footsteps continued, growing closer. When he finally found the courage to look, she was there, a little girl with golden hair, standing at the foot of his bed, in a white nightgown. Her eyes held the weight of 40 years of death, 40 years of justice delayed. "Hello, Father," she said in that same whispered voice from the confessional. "I've brought some friends." Behind her stood Timothy Morrison, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Beside him, a young girl with bruises around her throat, Sarah Chen, who had tried to tell Father Marcus about her uncle but had been dismissed as seeking attention. And others, so many others, all the children whose confessions had fallen on deaf ears, whose pleas for help had been met with empty prayers and hollow promises. Father Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came. The children began to move closer, their faces pale and serene, their eyes holding not anger but something far worse, disappointment. "We've been waiting, Father," the golden-haired girl said, "waiting for someone to hear our confession. But you were never really listening, were you?" The last thing Father Marcus saw was Timothy Morrison's broken smile as small, cold hands reached for him. In the morning, they found the priest in his bed, his face frozen in a silent scream, his hair turned completely white overnight. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who prepared the body noticed something odd. His ears were filled with what looked like wax, as if he had tried to block out some unbearable sound. The coroner ruled it a medical anomaly, but the mortician whispered to his wife that night about the expression on the priest's face. "It looked," he said, "like a man who had finally learned to listen." Father David Reeves had always prided himself on his discretion. In 15 years of hearing confessions, he had never broken the sacred seal, never betrayed a confidence. But he had also never forgotten a single sin that passed through his confessional screen. They accumulated in his mind like specimens in a collection, each one carefully catalogued and preserved. The obsession had started innocently enough. A photographic memory was a blessing in seminary. He could recite scripture perfectly, remember every theological argument, but in the confessional, that gift became something darker. Every whispered secret, every shameful admission, every terrible act, they all remained crystal clear in his mind, playing back in vivid detail whenever he closed his eyes. At first, he told himself it was professional interest, understanding the nature of sin, the patterns of human weakness. It was all part of his calling. But gradually, he began to see connections, to piece together the hidden lives of his parishioners like a vast, intricate puzzle. Mrs. Patterson's confession of adultery connected to Mr. Kellerman's admission of hiring a private investigator. Young Sarah's tears over her pregnancy linked to her father's violent rage in the booth the following week. Dr. Morrison's anguish over a misdiagnosis explained old Mr. Fletcher's sudden decline and death. Father Reeves began to see himself as the keeper of his community's true history, the guardian of secrets that revealed the real St. Mary's beneath its veneer of respectability. He started keeping notes, just brief ones at first, coded references that only he would understand. Soon, the notes became detailed journals, filled with names, dates, and sins. The power was intoxicating. To walk through town knowing everyone's deepest shame, to smile and nod at the very people whose darkest moments lived in his filing cabinet. He never acted on the information that would violate his oath, but simply possessing it, feeling the weight of their secrets in his hands, was enough. Then came the confession that changed everything. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice was male, middle-aged, with a slight tremor of nervousness. Father Reeves didn't recognize it immediately, which was unusual. He knew every voice in his parish. "Go on, my child. I know what you're doing, Father. I know about your collection." Father Reeves felt his blood freeze. "I don't understand." "The files in your study. The detailed records of every confession you've heard. Names, dates, sins, all carefully documented and cross-referenced." "That's quite a violation of the confessional seal, isn't it, Father?" The priest's mouth went dry. His study was locked, his files hidden behind volumes of theology. No one could have seen them. "Who are you? How did you?" "I'm someone who appreciates a fellow collector. You see, Father, I've been collecting things too, but my collection is a bit more tangible." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do. Tell me, Father, do you remember Margaret Henley's confession 3 years ago about the child she gave away when she was 16? Or how about Thomas Wright's admission about his gambling debts, the ones that led him to steal from the church fund?" Father Reeves gripped the arms of his chair. Those confessions were in his files, but he had never shared them with anyone. "Here's what's interesting, Father. Margaret Henley disappeared last month, just vanished from her apartment, no trace left behind. And Thomas Wright? Found dead in his garage 2 weeks ago. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Tragic accident, they said." The confessional suddenly felt like a tomb. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your little hobby has been very helpful to me. You collect their secrets, I collect. Well, let's just say I collect something more permanent. A souvenir from each of them. A finger, usually. Sometimes a tooth. Depends on my mood. Father Reeves tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. This is madness. You're confessing to murder. Oh, Father, I'm confessing to so much more than that. You see, I've been using your files for over 2 years now. Every sinner you've cataloged, every weakness you've documented, it all helps me choose my next acquisition. And the beautiful part is that you can never tell anyone. The seal of confession protects us both. The voice continued, growing more animated with each word. Mrs. Patterson was my first. That adultery you recorded so carefully, it gave me everything I needed to lure her to that motel room. She thought she was meeting her lover, but she met me instead. Her wedding ring finger made a lovely addition to my collection. Father Reeves felt vomit rise in his throat. Stop. Please, stop. Dr. Morrison was trickier. That misdiagnosis confession required more planning. But knowing his guilt, his schedule, his habits, all thanks to your meticulous notes, made it simple. He's in my freezer now, Father. All of him. Sometimes I take larger souvenirs. The litany of horrors continued. Name after name, each corresponding to a confession in Father Reeves' files, each now revealed to be a victim of the madman whispering in the darkness beside him. The priest had become an unwitting accomplice to a serial killer. His obsession with secrets transformed into a roadmap for murder. Who are you? Father Reeves whispered, though he dreaded the answer. Someone you know very well, Father. Someone who sits in your pews every Sunday, who shakes your hand after service, who contributes generously to the collection plate. Someone who's been watching you, studying you, appreciating your work from afar. This has to stop. I'll destroy the files. Oh, Father, you can't stop now. We're partners, you and I. You gather the intelligence, I execute the mission. It's a beautiful symbiosis. Father Reeves heard movement in the adjacent booth, the soft rustle of clothing. Through the screen's pattern of small holes, he caught a glimpse of something that made his heart stop. A mason jar, filled with what looked like small, pale objects, floating in preservative. The man's collection. I have to go now, Father. There's a young mother who confessed to shoplifting last week. Such a minor sin, really, but sin nonetheless. And according to your notes, she has the most beautiful hands. The booth beside him fell silent. Father Reeves sat frozen for what felt like hours before finally stumbling out of the confessional. The church was empty, the evening light filtering through stained glass windows, casting everything in shades of blood and shadow. That night, he tried to burn his files, but the flames seemed reluctant to catch. When they finally did, the smoke formed shapes that looked like reaching hands, and he could swear he heard voices crying out from the fire. The voices of his victims, begging for help that would never come. The next morning, police found Father Reeves in his study, surrounded by the charred remains of his confession files. He was catatonic, his eyes fixed on something only he could see, his lips moving in silent prayer. In his hand was a note written in someone else's handwriting. Thank you for your service, Father. Your collection made mine possible. Consider this my final confession. I am coming for you next. And when I do, I think I'll take your tongue. After all, it's the instrument of your betrayal. Father Reeves never spoke again. He spent his remaining years in a psychiatric facility, starting at every shadow, flinching from every visitor. The doctors said he seemed to be waiting for someone, watching the door with a mixture of dread and resignation. He died on a Tuesday morning, alone in his room. The orderlies found him clutching a small mason jar that hadn't been there the night before. Inside, floating in clear preservative, was a human tongue. The jar was empty when the coroner arrived. Father Antonio Silva had always believed that God's house was a sanctuary, a place where even the darkest souls could find redemption. The Gothic Cathedral of St. Augustine's, with its soaring spires and ancient stone walls, had stood for over 2 centuries as a beacon of hope in the old quarter of the city. But lately, something had changed in the sacred space, something that made Father Silva question everything he thought he knew about good and evil. It started with the night confessions. For 3 weeks running, someone had been slipping into the church after hours, when the doors should have been locked and the building empty. Father Silva would arrive for early morning prayers to find the confessional booth warm, as if recently occupied, with a lingering scent of sulfur and something else. Something organic and decay sweet that made his stomach turn. The first time it happened, he assumed someone had hidden in the church during evening mass and emerged after the doors were secured. He changed the locks, installed better security, but still the mysterious penitent returned. Security cameras showed nothing but shadows moving in impossible ways, dark shapes that seemed to bend and flow like liquid. Then came the night Father Silva decided to wait. He concealed himself in the sacristy after evening prayers, watching through a crack in the door as darkness settled over the cathedral. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the settling of old wood and stone. At exactly midnight, the temperature in the church plummeted. Father Silva's breath began to fog as he watched a shadow detach itself from the corner near the altar. But this wasn't an ordinary shadow. It moved independently of any light source, flowing across the floor like spilled ink. As it approached the confessional, the shadow began to take form, rising and shaping itself into a roughly human silhouette. The shadow figure entered the penitent's side of the confessional with a sound like whispered secrets. Father Silva felt an irresistible compulsion to take his place on the other side of the screen. His legs moved without conscious direction, carrying him to the priest's booth despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice was a chorus of whispers, each word spoken by a dozen different voices in perfect, terrible unison. "It has been an eternity since my last confession." Father Silva's mouth felt dry as sand. "What sins do you wish to confess?" "I am the shadow that falls behind every cruel word, the darkness that feeds on human hatred. I am the whisper that turns love to jealousy, trust to suspicion, hope to despair. I have walked behind humanity since the first murder, growing stronger with each act of malice." The priest's hands shook as he pressed them together in prayer. "All sins can be forgiven through God's grace." "Can they, Father? Even the sin of creating a monster? I don't understand." 157 years ago, in this very confessional, a priest heard the confession of a dying man. A man who had committed unspeakable acts against children, who had used his position of trust to destroy innocent lives. The priest, Father McKenna was his name, felt such rage, such disgust, that he forgot his calling. Instead of offering absolution, he cursed the dying man, condemned him to carry the weight of his sins forever. Father Silva felt cold spreading through his chest. He knew the story of Father McKenna, the priest who had supposedly gone mad and been removed from the parish in 1871. The church records were vague, mentioning only theological differences and a crisis of faith. Father McKenna's hatred was so pure, so absolute, that it gave me form. I became the living embodiment of his righteous fury, born from the collision of divine authority and human vengeance. And I have been growing ever since, feeding on the sins confessed in this very booth. The temperature continued to drop. Frost began forming on the wooden screen separating them. Every confession of abuse, every admission of cruelty, every whispered tale of violence, they all nourish me. But that's not my true sin, Father. My true sin is what I do with the strength I gain. What do you do? I visit those who confess their darkest deeds and receive absolution. I wait until they leave this place, convinced their sins are washed away, and then I remind them of what they truly are. I whisper their victims' names in their ears at night. I show them images of the pain they've caused. I strip away their peace, their sleep, their sanity, until they understand that some sins are too great for forgiveness. Father Silva realized he was trembling uncontrollably. God's mercy is infinite. Is it? Then why do the children still scream in their dreams? Why do the innocents I've watched suffer, carry their pain for decades while their tormentors walk free after a few mumbled words in this booth? Your God's mercy may be infinite, Father, but my hunger for justice is eternal. Through the screen, Father Silva could see the shadow shifting, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. Faces twisted in anguish, small hands reaching out in supplication, scenes of suffering that made him squeeze his eyes shut. I confess to driving 17 penitents to madness. I confess to haunting the dreams of 43 child abusers until they took their own lives. I confess to turning the peace of absolution into a torment that follows sinners to their graves and beyond. You're not seeking forgiveness, Father Silva whispered. "You're boasting." "Oh, but I am seeking something, Father. I'm seeking a partner." The shadow began to seep through the confessional screen, flowing like liquid darkness into the priest's booth. Father Silva tried to stand, but the cold had become so intense that his muscles wouldn't respond. "You see, Father, I've been watching you. I've seen how you struggle with the confessions you hear. The child molester who comes here every month, seeking forgiveness for crimes he continues to commit. The wife-beater who uses this booth like a reset button, absolving himself only to return home to his violence. The corrupt businessman who steals from orphanages and then donates a pittance to the church to clear his conscience." The darkness was everywhere now, surrounding Father Silva like a living shroud. "I've watched your face during those confessions, seen the disgust you try so hard to hide behind your holy words, the rage that builds in your chest when monsters kneel before you and expect God's mercy in exchange for empty promises of reform." Father Silva found his voice. "My personal feelings don't matter. My duty is to offer God's forgiveness to all who seek it. But what if they don't deserve it? What if your forgiveness enables them to continue hurting the innocent? What if every absolution you grant is another nail in a victim's coffin?" The shadow's whispers became more insistent, more seductive. "I'm offering you something better than helpless rage, Father. I'm offering you justice, true justice. Join with me, and we can ensure that those who confess their sins truly understand the weight of what they've done. We can make certain that their victims are avenged." Father Silva closed his eyes and began to pray, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. How many times had he granted absolution to people he suspected would sin again? How many victims had suffered because he had offered easy forgiveness to unrepentant predators? Think of little Maria Santos, Father. Remember her confession 3 months ago? How she cried as she told you about her uncle's late-night visits to her bedroom. And remember how you counseled patience? How you told her to pray for strength while you did nothing to stop her torment? The priest's eyes snapped open. Maria's uncle had indeed come to confession the following week, admitting to impure thoughts about his niece, but offering no real repentance, no intention to change. Father Silva had given him 3 Hail Marys and sent him on his way. "Maria tried to kill herself last week, Father. The pills are still pumping through her 10-year-old body as she lies in intensive care, fighting for a life she no longer wants to live. All because you chose to protect the sanctity of confession over the safety of a child." Father Silva felt something breaking inside his chest, a dam of suppressed rage and guilt finally giving way. "Join me, Father. Let me give you the power to ensure that monsters like Maria's uncle face consequences for their actions. Let me show you what real justice looks like." The shadow reached out with tendrils of darkness, offering an embrace that promised power, promised the ability to punish those who escaped earthly justice. Father Silva stared at the offered darkness for a long moment, feeling the weight of every unpunished sin, every victim he had failed to protect. Then he thought of Maria's tear-stained face, of all the other children who had sought help and found only empty prayers. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his hand. The moment his fingers touched the shadow, Father Silva felt a surge of terrible power flow through him. Images flashed through his mind. Every unrepentant sinner who had knelt in his confessional, every predator who had used God's forgiveness as a shield for their crimes. And with each image came a burning desire for retribution. The next morning, the cathedral's cleaning crew found the confessional booth empty but somehow changed. The wood had turned black as charcoal, and the air around it hummed with an energy that made everyone who approached feel suddenly, inexplicably afraid. Father Silva was never seen again, but strange things began happening to certain members of his former congregation. Child abusers woke to find their rooms filled with the sounds of children weeping. Violent spouses discovered they could no longer raise their hands in anger without experiencing phantom pain that drove them to their knees. Corrupt officials found themselves plagued by visions of every person their greed had harmed. Some said Father Silva had simply left the priesthood, unable to bear the weight of human sin. Others whispered that he had found a different kind of calling, a darker ministry that operated outside the bounds of divine mercy. But those few who dared to enter St. Augustine's after midnight reported seeing 2 shadows moving through the cathedral, one tall and priestly, the other flowing like spilled ink. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, They could hear the sound of whispered confessions echoing from an empty booth. Not confessions seeking forgiveness, but promises of justice that would follow sinners into eternity. The official church records list Father Silva as transferred to missionary work in remote locations. His current whereabouts are unknown, but there are reports from around the world of corrupt priests, violent criminals, and unpunished predators suddenly developing an inexplicable terror of the darkness and of confessional booths that seem to watch them with malevolent intent. Father Marcus Kellerman had been hearing confessions for 23 years, but he had never encountered a voice quite like the one that whispered through the lattice screen that October evening. The voice belonged to a woman, or what sounded like a woman, though there was something wrong with the cadence, something that made his skin crawl despite the warmth of the confessional booth. It was as if each word was being carefully constructed, pulled from some deep, dark place, and assembled with deliberate precision. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice began, and Marcus felt his blood run cold. The traditional words should have brought him comfort, as they had thousands of times before, but tonight they felt like ice water trickling down his spine. "How long has it been since your last confession?" Marcus asked, his trained voice steady despite the unease building in his chest. 43 years, 2 months, and 16 days, came the reply, measured and exact. "I have been away." Marcus shifted in his seat, the old wood creaking beneath him. In his decades of service, he had heard every conceivable sin, from the mundane jealousies of parish housewives to the darkest confessions of those consumed by guilt and shame. But something about this penitent felt different, wrong in a way that made his hands tremble as he reached for his rosary. "What sins do you wish to confess, my child?" he asked, though the word child felt grotesque on his tongue. Whatever knelt on the other side of the screen was no child of God. "I have killed," the voice said simply, "many times." In many ways, Marcus had heard murder confessed before. The weight of such sins was always heavy, but it was a weight he had learned to bear, to help others carry. This felt different. The voice held no remorse, no anguish, only a cold, clinical detachment that made his stomach turn. "Tell me about these acts," Marcus said, though every instinct screamed at him to flee the booth, to run from the church and never return. "The first was my mother," the voice continued, and Marcus could hear what might have been a smile in the words. "I was 7 years old. She had found my collection." "What collection?" "Birds, cats, small dogs. I kept them in mason jars under my bed. Their eyes were so beautiful when the life finally left them." Marcus gripped his rosary tighter, the worn beads cutting into his palm. "Child? These thoughts?" "Oh, Father," the voice interrupted, and now there was definitely laughter there, low and terrible. "These were not thoughts. I strangled my mother with her own rosary, just like the one you're holding now. I can hear the beads clicking through the screen. Such a familiar sound." The priest's blood turned to ice. He looked down at his hands, at the rosary he had been unconsciously working between his fingers, the soft click of bead against bead, suddenly deafening in the small space. "You're lying," Marcus whispered. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. There was too much detail, too much certainty in that horrible voice. "Am I, Father? Would you like me to describe how her face looked when she realized her own child, her precious, innocent child, was slowly squeezing the life from her throat? How her fingers clawed at the beads, trying to pull them away? How she tried to pray, even as I watched the light fade from her eyes?" Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. He had been trained for this, he told himself. He had been prepared to hear the worst of human nature, to offer forgiveness and guidance, even in the face of the most heinous acts. But this was something else entirely. "What happened after?" he managed to ask. "I buried her in the basement, told the neighbors she had gone to visit her sister. I lived in that house for 3 more years before the smell became too noticeable. By then, I had learned so much more about death, Father. So much more about the beautiful moment when a soul separates from its flesh." The voice paused, and in that silence, Marcus became aware of other sounds. The settling of the old church around them, the distant rumble of traffic, and underneath it all, something else. A sound like breathing, but wrong somehow. as if the lungs producing it were damaged or diseased. I moved after that, the voice resumed. Found new places, new opportunities. A nursing home in Pennsylvania where I worked the night shift. Such lonely old people, Father. So ready to die, so grateful when someone paid attention to them in their final moments. I must have eased 30 souls into the next world before anyone noticed the pattern. You killed 30 people? Eased their passage, the voice corrected. It was an act of mercy, really. They were suffering, forgotten by their families, abandoned by God. I simply helped them find peace. Marcus's training kicked in, overriding his horror. Taking a life is never merciful. Only God has the right to. God? The laughter that erupted from behind the screen was like breaking glass. Where was God when I prayed for my mother to stop screaming at night? Where was he when I begged to understand why I felt nothing when other children cried? I looked for God, Father. For years I searched. And do you know what I found? What? Marcus whispered, though he dreaded the answer. Nothing. An empty sky. Silent churches. Prayers that echoed into void. So I made my own purpose. I became the thing that answered other people's prayers for release. The breathing sound was getting louder now, more labored. Marcus realized with growing terror that it was coming from his side of the booth, from his own chest. His heart was hammering so hard he could barely think. After Pennsylvania, there was Ohio, a children's hospital. Such sick little ones, suffering so unnecessarily. Their parents would beg God to take their pain away, and God remained silent. But I was there. I listened. I acted. You killed children? The words came out as a strangled whisper. I liberated them. 27 beautiful souls, freed from their broken bodies. The youngest was just 3 years old, little Emma, with the brain tumor. She called me Angel as I pressed the pillow over her face. Marcus lurched forward, his stomach heaving. He pressed his hand over his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. In his peripheral vision, he caught sight of movement on the other side of the screen, a shadow shifting, changing shape in ways that human shadows shouldn't. You're sick, he gasped. You need help. This isn't confession, it's exactly what confession is supposed to be, Father. The unburdening of sin, the seeking of absolution. Isn't that your job? To forgive, no matter how terrible the transgression? Marcus felt trapped, pinned between his duty as a priest and his horror as a human being. The confessional, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. I can't. These aren't sins, they're abominations. You need to turn yourself in to seek justice. Justice? The voice had changed now, become something deeper, more resonant. I have been seeking justice for 43 years, Father, and tonight, I think I've finally found it. The shadow on the other side of the screen was moving again, but now it seemed to be growing, expanding beyond the physical boundaries of the booth. Marcus rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating, but when he looked again, tendrils of darkness were seeping through the lattice, reaching toward him like grasping fingers. You see, Father, after Ohio came Michigan. A seminary, actually. Not unlike the one where you trained, I imagine. Young men, full of faith and hope, preparing to serve God. I worked in the kitchen there, preparing their meals, listening to their prayers, watching their devotion. Marcus's blood ran cold. He remembered Michigan. He remembered the seminary. He remembered the food poisoning that had killed 6 seminarians his final year, including his roommate, David. That's impossible, he breathed. That was 40 years ago. You'd have to be 73 years old, the voice completed. Does this sound like the voice of a 73-year-old woman to you, Father? It didn't. It sounded like something that had never been human at all. David Marlowe was your roommate, wasn't he, Father? Such a devout young man. He prayed so earnestly, right up until the strychnine began to work. He called your name as he died. Did you know that? He called for you to help him, but you were in the library, studying, always so dedicated to your calling. Marcus felt the world tilting around him. David's death had haunted him for decades. The guilt of not being there, of not somehow preventing it, had driven him to work harder, pray longer, dedicate his entire life to serving others in penance for his perceived failure. You killed David, he whispered, among others. But David was special. His faith was so pure, so absolute. Even as he died, he believed God would save him. Even as his body convulsed and his heart stopped, he maintained his trust in divine mercy. It was beautiful and pathetic and utterly inspiring. The darkness was definitely moving now, flowing through the screen like liquid shadow. Marcus pressed himself back against the wall of the booth, but there was nowhere to go. Why? He managed to ask. Why kill innocent people? Why torment their loved ones? Because, Father, I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what it felt like to have that kind of faith, that absolute trust in something greater. So I studied it. I collected it. Every person I killed taught me something new about belief, about hope, about the moment when both are finally extinguished. And what did you learn? That faith is just another word for delusion. That hope is simply the refusal to accept reality. That God, if He exists at all, is either powerless to stop suffering or unwilling to do so. Either way, He's useless. The shadow tendrils had reached Marcus now, cold and substantial as they wrapped around his wrists and ankles. He tried to pull away, but they held him fast, and where they touched, his skin began to burn with a cold fire that went deeper than flesh. But you, Father, the voice continued, and now it seemed to be coming from all around him, from the walls themselves. You've spent your entire adult life trying to atone for David's death. 40 years of service, of hearing confessions, of offering comfort to the grieving. 40 years of believing that somehow you could balance the scales. I tried to do good, Marcus gasped as the cold fire spread up his arms. You did do good. You saved lives, Father. You prevented suicides, helped heal marriages, guided lost souls back to the light. Your work mattered. Your faith was real. And that's precisely why I've been waiting for you. The booth was dissolving around them now, the familiar wood and fabric melting away like wax, revealing something vast and dark and impossibly cold. Marcus found himself suspended in nothingness, held only by the shadow things that continued to wrap around him like serpents. You see, after 43 years of studying faith, of collecting it from the dying, I've come to a realization. I understand now what I was truly searching for all along. What? Marcus could barely speak now, the cold fire having spread to his chest, making each breath an agony. Absolution. The word hung in the darkness like a blade, sharp and terrible and final. I have killed 63 people, Father. 63 souls whose only crime was believing in something greater than themselves. I have spent 4 decades perfecting the art of destroying hope, of snuffing out faith, of proving that God is either absent or impotent. And now I want to be forgiven for it. That's not how it works, Marcus struggled to say. Forgiveness requires repentance. You have to be sorry. You have to want to change. I don't want to change, Father. I want absolution without repentance. I want forgiveness without redemption. I want you to tell me that all of it was acceptable, that my crimes were justified, that I am washed clean of sin without having to give up the beautiful darkness I've cultivated. I can't do that. I won't. Oh, but you will, Father, because I have one more confession to make. The shadow things tightened around him, and Marcus screamed as the cold fire reached his heart. The food poisoning at the seminary. It wasn't random. I chose my victims very carefully. David Marlowe, Thomas Chen, Robert Hayes, Michael O'Brien, James Patterson, and William Torres. 6 young men who would have gone on to serve God faithfully for decades. 6 men who would have saved countless souls, who would have brought light into dark places, who would have made the world a better place through their faith. Marcus felt something breaking inside his chest, something more fundamental than ribs or organs. I killed them not because I hated their faith, but because I wanted to understand it. And the only way to truly understand light is to study the moment when it goes out. I fed on their faith as they died, Father. I consumed their hope, their trust, their certainty that God would save them. And it was delicious. No, Marcus whispered, but the word had no power here in the darkness. Yes, and now, 40 years later, I've found the most faithful servant of them all, the man who dedicated his entire life to atoning for their deaths, the priest who heard 100,000 confessions, who saved 10,000 souls, who never once doubted his calling despite witnessing humanity at its worst. The cold fire reached Marcus's brain, and suddenly he could see it all clearly. The nursing home victims, their faces peaceful in death, The children in the hospital, their suffering finally ended. The seminarians, his friends, his brother in faith, dying alone and afraid because he hadn't been there to help them. And now, the voice said, and Marcus realized it was coming from his own mouth. I want you to tell me that all of it was justified. That 63 murders were simply God's plan. That faith and hope and love are meaningless in the face of entropy and death. I want you to absolve me, Father. I want you to break your own faith by granting me forgiveness I don't deserve. Marcus felt his lips moving, felt words forming in his throat, but they were not his words. The thing that had consumed 63 souls was speaking through him now, using his voice, his authority, his sacred calling to mock everything he had ever believed in. I absolve you, he heard himself say, and the words were acid on his tongue. Your sins are forgiven. The laughter that erupted from his own throat was like the sound of the world ending. Thank you, Father, the thing said with his voice. Now you understand. Faith is nothing but a weakness to be exploited. Hope is simply the refusal to see reality. And love is just another word for the delusion that anything in this universe truly matters. Marcus felt his consciousness being pushed deeper, felt the thing settling into his body like a parasite claiming its host. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. He tried to remember the faces of the people he had helped over the years, but they were fading, becoming dim and meaningless. The last thing he managed to think, as the darkness claimed him completely, was a prayer not for himself, but for the parishioners who would come to him for confession in the days ahead. Because something that wore his face and spoke with his voice would be waiting for them in the booth, hungry for their faith, eager to consume their hope, ready to prove once and for all that in a universe ruled by entropy and death, even the most sacred places offered no sanctuary from the dark. Father Marcus Kellerman died that night in the confessional booth of St. Catherine's Church, though his body continued to breathe, continued to move, continued to hear confessions for years afterward. And every person who came to that booth seeking forgiveness found something else entirely, a thing that fed on faith and excreted despair, a creature that had learned to perfectly mimic absolution while delivering only damnation. The church still stands today, and Father Kellerman still hears confessions every evening at 7 o'clock. The parishioners speak highly of him, noting how he seems to understand their darkest secrets, how he never judges, how he always grants them absolution. But if you look carefully, you might notice how their eyes change after they leave the booth, how their faith seems dimmer, their hope more fragile, their love more conditional. And if you listen closely to his voice through the lattice screen, you might hear something underneath the familiar words of comfort and forgiveness. You might hear the sound of something ancient and hungry, feeding on the very thing it pretends to protect. And once you hear it, you'll never be able to confess again. Father Marcus had been hearing confessions for 37 years, but nothing had prepared him for the voice that came through the lattice screen that October evening. The Church of St. Augustine sat in the heart of Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone, yet the voice belonged to no parishioner he recognized. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice whispered, barely audible above the autumn wind rattling the stained glass windows. The tone was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to exist in some liminal space between human and something else entirely. "How long has it been since your last confession, my child?" Father Marcus asked, settling into his familiar role despite the unease creeping up his spine. "Time has no meaning where I've been, Father. I've come to confess not my sins, but the sins that will be." The priest's hand tightened on his rosary. In all his years, no one had ever spoken of future transgressions. "I'm afraid I don't understand. We confess what we have done, not what we might do." A sound like dry leaves rustling filled the confessional booth. "But what if the future is as certain as the past, Father? What if I've seen what comes next, and it's written in blood and screams?" Father Marcus felt his mouth go dry. Through the screen, he could make out only a dark silhouette, hunched and trembling. "Tell me what troubles you, child. God's mercy knows no bounds. In 3 days, Mrs. Patterson will lose her faith. She'll find her husband with another woman, and in her rage, she'll take a kitchen knife to them both. The blood will pool beneath their bed like a crimson lake. The priest's blood chilled. Margaret Patterson was one of his most devoted parishioners, married 40 years to loving Tom Patterson. The idea of her committing such violence seemed impossible. That's a very specific concern. Has Mrs. Patterson spoken to you about problems in her marriage? In 5 days, young Timothy Walsh will steal his father's gun. He'll walk into Jefferson Elementary during lunch hour. 23 children will never see their parents again. Father Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Timothy Walsh was barely 16, a quiet boy who helped clean the church every Sunday. I think perhaps you should speak with someone else. Someone trained in 7 days, Father. You will break your vows. The altar boy, David Chen, will stay late to help you organize the vestments. You'll touch him in ways that will scar his soul forever. He'll never tell anyone, but the shame will eat at him until he takes his own life at 19. Stop! The word came out as a harsh whisper. Father Marcus felt sick, not just at the accusation, but at the tiny voice in the back of his mind that recognized the temptation he'd been fighting for months. David was a beautiful boy, innocent and trusting, and the priest had caught himself looking too long, thinking forbidden thoughts. You want to leave the booth now, don't you, Father? You want to run from these truths, but running won't change them. These aren't truths. These are horrible fantasies. Are they? Mrs. Patterson received a phone call an hour ago, a woman's voice telling her to check her husband's email. She's reading those messages right now, Father. Her world is cracking apart like ice on a frozen lake. Father Marcus felt the walls of the confessional closing in. Even if that were true, people have choices. Free will. We can choose differently. The laughter that emerged from the other side of the screen was like the sound of bones breaking. Oh, Father, you still don't understand. I'm not predicting these things. I'm confessing them. I am the whisper in Mrs. Patterson's ear. I am the rage that will guide her hand. I am the despair that will drive Timothy to violence. I am the lust that will destroy your soul and that boy's innocence. The temperature in the confessional plummeted. Father Marcus could see his breath misting in the air. What are you? I am what crawls through the spaces between prayers, Father. I am what feeds on the gaps in faith. I am confession itself, the dark acknowledgement of every human failing, every secret shame, every buried sin. For 37 years, you've listened to humanity's darkest secrets, and I've grown stronger with each whispered transgression. The priest tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Through the screen, the silhouette began to change, growing larger, more angular. You created me, Father. Every confession you've heard, every sin you've absorbed in this booth, they've all become part of me. I am the weight of every wrong you've carried, the sum of every evil thought you've tried to wash clean with prayer. That's not how it works, Father Marcus stammered. Confession cleanses sin, it doesn't collect it. Does it, Father? Then why do you dream of the murders you've heard confessed? Why do you wake in cold sweats, remembering the details of every rape, every theft, every betrayal? The sins don't disappear, they settle into you like sediment and still water. The priest realized with growing horror that it was true. He could remember every terrible confession from the past decades, could recite them like a catalog of human depravity. They lived in his mind, a vast library of wrongdoing that he'd thought he was helping to absolve. The beauty of it, the voice continued, is that you'll try to stop these things from happening. You'll warn Mrs. Patterson, you'll speak to Timothy's parents, you'll transfer David to another parish, but in trying to prevent these futures, you'll ensure they come to pass. Free will is an illusion when the outcome is inevitable. Father Marcus grabbed the door handle of his side of the confessional, desperate to escape. It wouldn't budge. The metal was ice cold and seemed fused to the frame. Mrs. Patterson has just found the photographs in her husband's desk drawer. Timothy Walsh is in his father's study, staring at the gun cabinet. And little David Chen is walking toward the church right now, wondering why Father Marcus called and asked him to come alone tonight. No, the priest whispered. I never called David. I would never. But you did, Father, 5 minutes ago. Don't you remember? You asked him to help organize the vestments. You were very specific about coming alone, about not telling his parents. Father Marcus felt his pockets frantically. His cell phone was gone. But that was impossible. He'd had it when he entered the confessional. Through the church walls, he could hear footsteps approaching, young and eager. "David?" he called out, his voice cracking. "David, don't come in here. Go home." But the footsteps continued, accompanied by a young voice calling back. "Father Marcus, you said you needed help with the vestments? I'm here." The thing on the other side of the confessional laughed again, a sound like broken glass grinding together. "The beautiful irony, Father, is that in trying to warn him away, you'll frighten the boy. You'll run toward the vestment room to hide. You'll follow to comfort him. And in that small, private space, surrounded by holy garments, you'll discover that your flesh is weaker than your faith." "I won't do it," Father Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Whatever you are, whatever power you think you have, I won't hurt that boy." "Oh, but you will, because I am not just the collector of sins, Father. I am also the creator of them." The whisper that says, "just this once." The rationalization that makes evil seem reasonable. The moment of weakness that defines a lifetime. The priest could feel something changing in his mind, a dark warmth spreading through his thoughts. Images flashed behind his eyes, David's trusting smile, the curve of his neck, the soft skin of his hands. The forbidden thoughts he'd been fighting for months were growing stronger, more insistent. "Fight it," he whispered to himself. "Pray." But when he tried to recite the Lord's Prayer, the words that came out were different. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in David as it is in heaven." There's no fighting what you are, Father. I am simply revealing the truth that was always there. You chose this profession not to serve God, but to have access to vulnerable children. Every prayer was a lie. Every blessing was a mask. Father Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. The worst part was that he couldn't tell anymore if the voice was lying. The thoughts in his head felt like his own thoughts. The desires felt real and urgent. Through the church walls, David's voice came again. "Father Marcus, are you in the confessional? I can wait if you're busy." "Tell him to go home," the voice whispered. "Or tell him to come to you. The choice is yours, Father. Free will in action." The priest pressed his hands against his temples, trying to think clearly. But every thought led back to the same dark place. He could picture David's face. Picture what would happen next. The worst part was that some diseased corner of his mind wanted it to happen. "Father, I heard voices. Are you okay?" Father Marcus looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. When he spoke, he wasn't sure if the words were his own or if they came from the thing sharing the confessional with him. "Come here, David. Come to me, child. Father has something special to show you." The footsteps changed direction, moving toward the confessional. In the booth across from him, the dark silhouette began to fade. "My work here is done," the voice whispered, growing distant. 3 days from now, when the police find Mrs. Patterson covered in blood, she'll claim a voice told her to check her husband's emails. 5 days from now, Timothy Walsh will tell investigators that something whispered in his ear during the shooting, guiding his hands. And tonight, when they find you with David, the voice trailed off, replaced by the sound of the confessional door opening. Father Marcus turned to see David Chen standing in the doorway, his young face lit by concern and trust. "Are you all right, Father? You look pale." The priest stared at the boy, feeling the darkness in his mind coiling tighter around his thoughts. In the empty confessional booth across from him, something that might have been laughter echoed in the shadows. "Close the door, David," Father Marcus heard himself say. "What happens next must stay between us and God." As the door clicked shut, the last thing the priest saw was his reflection in the darkened window of the church. But it wasn't his face looking back at him anymore. Father Gabriel Reyes had always believed that the confessional was sacred ground, a place where souls could unburden themselves and find peace. St. Maria Guadalupe had been his parish for 15 years, serving the tight-knit community of San Esperanza with devotion and compassion. He thought he had heard every kind of sin, every form of human failing. He was wrong. It started on a Tuesday in November, just after evening mass. The last parishioner had left, and Father Gabriel was preparing to close the church when he heard movement in the confessional booth. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes people slipped in during the final hymn, too ashamed to wait in line with the regular congregants. "I'll be right with you," he called out, quickly donning his stole and entering his side of the booth. The familiar partition separated him from the penitent, the carved wooden screen allowing voices to pass while preserving anonymity. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," came a voice he recognized immediately. It was Maria Vasquez, a woman in her 70s who came to confession every week, usually admitting to minor infractions, harsh words to her daughter-in-law, missing morning prayers, harboring resentment toward her noisy neighbors. "How long has it been since your last confession, Maria?" 7 days, Father. But this time is different." There was something in her tone that made Father Gabriel lean forward. In all the years he'd known Maria, he'd never heard her sound so distressed. "Tell me what troubles you, my child." "I killed someone, Father." The words hung in the air like smoke. Father Gabriel blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, Maria. Could you repeat that?" "I killed someone. Last night. With a kitchen knife. There was so much blood, Father. It wouldn't stop flowing." The priest felt his mouth go dry. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maria Vasquez was barely 5 feet tall, arthritic, and one of the gentlest souls in his congregation. "Maria, I think perhaps you had a nightmare, or I can still feel it under my fingernails," she continued, her voice eerily calm. "The way the blade went in, the sound he made when I twisted it, like air escaping from a balloon." Father Gabriel's training took over. Even if this was a delusion, he needed to handle it carefully. "Who do you believe you hurt, Maria?" "My grandson, Carlos. He came to visit last night, you see. Brought his new girlfriend. Such a pretty girl, Father. Reminded me of myself when I was young." Her voice took on a dreamy quality. "But then I saw what he was really doing to her. The marks on her arms, the way she flinched when he touched her, the fear in her eyes." Carlos Vasquez was a troubled young man, Father Gabriel knew. He'd been in and out of jail for drug offenses and had a reputation for violence. But Maria adored him, always made excuses for his behavior. "So I waited until she went to use the bathroom," Maria continued, "and I told Carlos I had something to show him in the kitchen. He followed me, laughing about something on his phone. He wasn't paying attention when I picked up the knife." "Maria," Father Gabriel said gently, "I think we should call your daughter. Maybe have someone come check on you. I stabbed him 17 times, Father. Once for every year since his confirmation." He kept trying to speak, but the blood kept bubbling up through his mouth. Finally, he just stopped. The priest felt a chill run down his spine. The specificity of the details, the calm way she recounted them. It didn't sound like the ramblings of a confused elderly woman. "Where's Carlos now, Maria?" "In my basement freezer, next to the Christmas ham." She paused. "I should probably eat that soon. It's been in there since last year." Father Gabriel stood up abruptly. "Maria, I need you to wait here. I'm going to make a phone call." "Oh, but Father, I'm not finished with my confession yet." Something in her tone made him sit back down. Through the screen, he could see her silhouette, and it seemed different somehow. Larger than he remembered. "There's more?" "So much more, Father. You see, killing Carlos was just the beginning. It felt so liberating. All these years, I've been this little old woman that everyone dismisses, everyone ignores. But with the knife in my hand, I felt powerful for the first time in decades." Father Gabriel reached for his cell phone, but his pocket was empty. He must have left it in the sacristy. After Carlos stopped breathing, his girlfriend came looking for him. Sweet little thing, maybe 19 years old. When she saw what I'd done, she started screaming. So I had to quiet her down. "Maria, please," I used the same knife. But with her, I took my time. I wanted to understand how it felt, you know, the transition from life to death. "It's beautiful, Father. Like watching a candle go out." The priest tried to process what he was hearing. Maria Vasquez, who brought him homemade tamales and worried about the homeless cats behind the church, was describing murder with the detachment of someone discussing the weather. "I put her in the freezer too. Had to rearrange some things to make room. Good thing I have that big chest freezer in the basement." "Maria," Father Gabriel said, his voice shaking, "this has to stop. If what you're telling me is true," "Oh, it's true, Father, but I'm just getting started. You see, I realized something tonight. All these years, coming to confession, admitting to tiny sins, asking forgiveness for nothing. What's the point? If I'm going to confess, shouldn't it be for something worth confessing? The temperature in the confessional seemed to drop. Father Gabriel could see his breath misting in the air. So I made a list, Father. All the people who've wronged me over the years. All the people who've dismissed me, ignored me, treated me like I was already dead. It's a long list. Maria, you need help. This isn't you talking, isn't it? How do you know who I really am, Father? You've listened to my confessions for 15 years, but you've never really seen me. None of you have. I'm just the little old lady in the back pew, practically invisible. Through the screen, Father Gabriel could see Maria's silhouette shifting, changing. It looked like she was growing taller, her shoulders broadening. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, she's next. Always so rude, always acting like I'm wasting her time. I think I'll visit her tomorrow morning, early. She lives alone, you know. Won't be found for days. I have to call the police, Father Gabriel said, standing again. Sit down, Father. The command came with such authority that the priest found himself obeying before he realized what he was doing. You can't leave the confessional, Father. Not until I'm finished. That's the rule, isn't it? The seal of confession. Sacred and inviolable. Father Gabriel realized, with growing horror, that she was right. The confessional seal was absolute. He couldn't reveal anything said here. Couldn't act on information received in confession. Even if Maria was confessing to murder, his vows bound him to silence. You're trapped, aren't you, Father? By your own faith, by your own rules. Maria's laugh was cold and sharp. I can confess to anything I want, and you have to sit there and listen. You have to absolve me. I don't have to give you absolution for sins you haven't yet committed, but I have committed them, Father. In my heart, in my mind, they're already done. Isn't that what your Jesus said? That to think a sin is to commit it? Father Gabriel felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Intent to commit sin is not the same as the sin itself. Then let me be more specific. After I leave here tonight, I'm going to Mrs. Henderson's house. I'm going to knock on her door and tell her I'm having chest pains. She'll let me in. People always help little old ladies. Then I'm going to gut her like a fish. The priest pressed his hands against his temples. Stop, please. Then I'm going to visit Father Martinez at St. 26. Joseph's. Remember him, Father? He's the one who got the promotion you wanted 5 years ago. I'm going to confess to him too, but I think I'll use poison for him. Something slow. I want him to have time to understand what's happening. Father Gabriel tried to stand again, but found he couldn't. It was as if some invisible force was pressing him down into his chair. You can't move, can you, Father? That's because this isn't really a confession. This is something else entirely. Through the screen, Maria's silhouette continued to change. The hunched shoulders straightened, the gray hair seemed to darken and flow. The voice, when it came again, was deeper, more resonant. You see, Father, I'm not really Maria Vasquez. I'm something that's been wearing her face, using her voice, living in her skin. But tonight, I'm tired of pretending to be harmless. What are you? Father Gabriel whispered. I am what grows in the spaces between prayers, Father. I am the doubt that creeps in during the darkest nights. I am the voice that whispers, what if God isn't listening? I am every unanswered prayer, every moment of divine silence, every crack in faith. The thing wearing Maria's voice laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. For 15 years, I've sat in your pews, listened to your sermons, watched you perform your little rituals. All that faith, all that certainty, it made me hungry. Hungry to show you what your precious God really thinks of his faithful servants. Father Gabriel tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Every time he began the Lord's Prayer, the syllables twisted in his mouth, becoming something else, something wrong. Poor Father Gabriel, so devoted, so pure. Do you know what your congregation really thinks of you? Mrs. Santos thinks you're weak. The Morales family thinks you're boring. Half your parishioners only come to Mass out of habit, not faith. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you felt God's presence, Father? When was the last time you prayed and felt that warm certainty that someone was listening? Be honest. Father Gabriel tried to remember, but the truth was crushing. It had been months since he'd felt anything during prayer except the echo of his own voice. The silences had grown longer, emptier. I can see it in your eyes, Father. The doubt, The fear that maybe there's nothing out there after all. Maybe you've devoted your life to empty air. The priest felt tears starting to flow. My faith is strong. Is it? Then prove it. Break the confessional seal. Walk out of here and call the police. Save Mrs. Henderson. Save Father Martinez. Show me that your faith is stronger than your rules. Father Gabriel reached toward the door handle of the confessional. His fingers were inches away from escape, from action, from preventing murder, but he couldn't make them move the final distance. The seal of confession was absolute, sacred, inviolable. You see, your faith has made you complicit in murder. Your precious rules have turned you into an accessory. What kind of God demands such blind obedience that his servants become accomplices to evil? The thing in the booth across from him stood up, and its shadow filled the entire screen. When it spoke again, its voice was no longer Maria's. It was something vast and hollow and hungry. I want you to give me absolution, Father. I want you to forgive me for every murder I'm about to commit. I want your God's official blessing on the blood that will flow. I won't do it. You will. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows that Father Gabriel Reyes heard confession from a serial killer and chose to do nothing. I'll make sure they know you could have saved lives, but chose your precious vows instead. Father Gabriel looked at his trembling hands. In the candlelight, they looked old, useless. Even if I wanted to stop you, I don't know how. That's the beauty of it, Father. You can't stop me because your faith won't let you. The very thing you've built your life around has become a cage, and I am going to fill that cage with screams. The priest closed his eyes and tried one more time to pray. But instead of comfort, all he felt was the weight of silence pressing down on him like a gravestone. Say the words, Father. Give me absolution. Father Gabriel opened his mouth, and despite every instinct screaming against it, he heard himself speaking the ancient formula. I absolve you of your sins, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The moment the words left his lips, the thing across from him laughed with pure joy. Thank you, Father. Now, no matter what happens next, God himself has forgiven me through you. The blood is on your hands now. Father Gabriel heard the other confessional door open and close. Through the main door of the church, he could see a figure walking out into the night. Small, hunched, looking exactly like harmless old Maria Vasquez. He tried to stand, tried to follow, tried to do something, but he remained frozen in the confessional booth, trapped by his own vows, his own faith, his own rules. Outside, in the darkness, something wearing a familiar face walked toward its first victim, carrying the priest's absolution like a blessing and a curse. Father Gabriel sat alone in the confessional, staring at his reflection in the darkened screen. For the first time in his life, he prayed that God wasn't listening. Father Thomas Ashford had served at Holy Cross Cathedral for 23 years, and in all that time, he had never questioned the architecture of the confessionals. They were old, built into the stone walls of the cathedral when it was constructed in 1847. The wood was dark oak, almost black with age, and the screens were carved with intricate religious motifs that seemed to shift in the candlelight. It wasn't until the whispers started that he began to wonder about the space between the walls. The first whisper came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in March. Father Ashford was hearing confessions, working through the usual parade of guilty consciences and minor transgressions, when he heard a voice that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. "She's lying," the voice whispered, barely audible above the drumming rain on the cathedral windows. Father Ashford paused mid-absolution. Mrs. Chen, a regular penitent, was confessing to speaking harshly to her elderly mother, a confession she made almost weekly. The priest had assumed it was scrupulosity, an obsessive need to confess minor failings. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. Could you repeat that last part?" "I said I raised my voice to my mother about her medications. I feel terrible about it." But the whisper came again, clearer this time. "She's been stealing her mother's pain pills, selling them to buy lottery tickets. The old woman screams in agony every night while her daughter gambles away her relief." Father Ashford felt his blood go cold. "Mrs. Chen, is there anything else you need to confess?" There was a long pause. Finally, Mrs. Chen spoke, her voice shaking. "No, Father. just my impatience. After giving absolution and watching Mrs. Chen leave, Father Ashford sat alone in the confessional, straining to hear where the whisper had come from. The cathedral was empty, silent except for the rain and his own breathing. "Hello?" he called softly. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered. The whispers came more frequently after that. During confession with teenage Roberto Martinez, "He's not confessing to shoplifting candy, Father. Show him your wallet." Father Ashford checked his pocket and discovered his money was missing. When elderly Mr. Patterson confessed to occasional lustful thoughts about women other than his wife. Ask him about the cameras in the women's bathroom at his restaurant. The priest found himself staring at the man with new horror. Each whisper revealed a deeper truth hidden beneath the surface confession. And each time, Father Ashford found the information was accurate. Roberto's pockets were indeed full of stolen merchandise. A discreet investigation revealed Mr. Patterson's restaurant had been closed twice for maintenance issues involving the restrooms. The worst part was that the whispers were helping. Confronted with evidence of their deeper sins, his parishioners eventually confessed the whole truth. They seemed lighter afterward, genuinely cleansed. Father Ashford began to think perhaps God was working through mysterious means to reveal the hidden corners of human transgression. That changed the night the whispers turned toward him. It was late October, well past the usual time for confession, when Father Ashford heard footsteps in the cathedral. He'd been staying after hours more frequently, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name to sit in the confessional and listen to the building settle around him. "Father Ashford," came a voice from the other side of the screen. It was definitely human this time, not one of the whispers from the walls. "I need to confess." The priest couldn't see much through the carved screen, just the suggestion of a hunched figure in dark clothing. "Of course, my child. How long has it been since your last confession?" "I've never confessed before, Father. I've been waiting for the right priest, someone who would understand." There was something familiar about the voice, but Father Ashford couldn't place it. "God's mercy is infinite. Whatever burden you carry, it can be lifted." "I collect secrets, Father." The simple statement hung in the air like smoke. "I'm sorry?" "Secrets. I collect them. I've been collecting them for, a very long time. And this cathedral, your confessional, it's been particularly productive." Father Ashford felt the familiar chill that preceded the whispers from the walls, but this time no whisper came. Instead, the figure in the opposite booth leaned forward, and the priest caught a glimpse of an impossibly aged face, skin like cracked parchment, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "You've been hearing my whispers, haven't you, Father? Learning the real sins hiding beneath the false ones. I've been so helpful." The whispers. That was you? Not me directly. Think of them as recordings, echoes of every secret ever spoken in this confessional. You see, Father, confession doesn't destroy sins. It concentrates them. All that guilt, all that shame, all those carefully hidden truths, they don't disappear when you grant absolution. They seep into the wood, soak into the stone, layer upon layer, year after year. Father Ashford tried to stand, but his legs felt weak. That's not how confession works, isn't it? Then where do you think all that evil goes, Father? When someone confesses to adultery, to theft, to murder, do you really think a few Latin words make it vanish? Or does it settle like sediment into the sacred spaces where it was spoken? The old man's laugh was like the sound of paper tearing. "I've been feeding on the secrets of this confessional for over a century, Father, growing stronger with each whispered sin, each hidden shame. And you, dear Thomas, have been such a wonderful collector." "I don't understand." "Of course you do. You felt it, haven't you? The hunger for more secrets, deeper secrets. The way you press your parishioners to confess beyond their original sins. The satisfaction you feel when the whispers reveal their hidden truths." Father Ashford realized with growing horror that it was true. He had been pushing harder during confessions, asking leading questions, feeling almost disappointed when someone confessed only minor sins. The whispers had become addictive, the revelations intoxicating. "You've been cultivating them for me, Father, like a gardener tending to particularly delicious fruit. Each time you coax out a deeper truth, each time you use my whispers to expose hidden sins, you feed me. and I grow stronger. The priest forced himself to stand. I'm leaving. This conversation is over. Oh, but Father, the old man said, his voice taking on a mocking tone, you haven't heard my confession yet, and mine is substantial. Despite every instinct telling him to run, Father Ashford found himself sitting back down. The compulsion was overwhelming, as if the confessional itself was pulling him back into his chair. I have been in this cathedral for 137 years, Father. I arrived the night Father Mackenzie hanged himself in the bell tower. Did you know about that? It's not in your official church history. Poor Father Mackenzie couldn't bear the weight of the secrets anymore. The things people confessed to him, the darkness he carried, it drove him mad. The old man paused, and Father Ashford heard the sound of fingers drumming against wood. That's when I moved in, you see. Slipped into the space he left behind. And I've been growing ever since, feeding on every confession, collecting every secret. Do you want to know what I've learned, Father? Do you want to hear the real sins of your precious congregation? No, Father Ashford whispered. But even as he spoke, he knew he was lying. He did want to know. The hunger for secrets had become so strong it felt like starvation. Mrs. Patterson didn't just discover her husband's infidelity, Father. She poisoned him. Slow, careful doses of antifreeze in his coffee. It took 3 months. She confessed to you about anger and resentment, but she never mentioned the murder. Father Ashford felt sick. Stop. Young David Chen, the altar boy, his confession about impure thoughts? He was confessing to molesting his younger sister every night, Father, while their parents work late shifts. She's only 7. Please stop. But you don't want me to stop, do you, Father? I can see it in your eyes. You want to know more. You want to know about Dr. Morrison's illegal organ harvesting. You want to know about the mayor's human trafficking operation. You want to know about the kindergarten teacher who's been slowly poisoning the children in her class. Father Ashford pressed his hands over his ears, but the words seemed to come from inside his skull. None of this is true. You're lying. Am I? Use your phone, Father. Call the police about Mrs. Patterson. Check the missing persons reports for the past 5 years. See how many match Dr. Morrison's surgical patients who never came home. Visit little Susan Chen at the hospital, where she's been treated for mysterious injuries. Even if any of this were true, I can't act on information from confession. The seal. Oh, but these aren't confessions, Father. These are my secrets, my collection. I'm not bound by your little rules. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to fill the entire cathedral. I'm offering you a trade. What kind of trade? I'll give you proof, Father. Evidence of every crime, every hidden sin, every terrible secret. You could be a hero. You could save lives. Father Marcus Benedetti had been hearing confessions for 23 years, but nothing had prepared him for what walked into his booth on that rain-soaked October evening. The ancient wooden confessional creaked under the weight of St. Catherine's 200-year history, its Gothic arches casting long shadows in the dim candlelight that flickered across the nave. The church was empty, save for old Mrs. Kowalski, who mumbled her rosary in the front pew as she did every evening at 7. Father Marcus had been about to close the confessional when he heard the heavy footsteps echoing through the sanctuary. The person who entered the booth moved with deliberate slowness, each step resonating like a funeral march against the marble floor. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, came the voice through the ornate screen. It was a woman's voice, melodious yet cold, like wind chimes in a winter storm. It has been quite some time since my last confession. Father Marcus adjusted his stole and leaned closer to the partition. Something about the voice unsettled him, though he couldn't place why. Perhaps it was the way she emphasized certain words, or how her breathing seemed unnaturally steady, like someone consciously controlling each inhalation. How long has it been, my child? He asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority he'd cultivated over decades of ministry. Since 1847, she replied matter-of-factly. Father Marcus paused, assuming he'd misheard. The rain drummed harder against the stained glass windows, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. I'm sorry, did you say 1,847? Yes, Father, 176 years, 3 months, and 14 days, to be precise. A chill ran down Father Marcus's spine. He'd encountered his share of disturbed individuals, people whose grip on reality had loosened under life's pressures. Mental illness was more common than people wanted to admit, and the church often became a refuge for those seeking solace from their inner demons. "I see," he said carefully. "And what brings you to confession tonight?" Through the screen, he could make out her silhouette, tall, willowy, dressed in what appeared to be a long dark coat or dress. Her hands rested, folded in her lap, perfectly still. "I killed them all, Father," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the confessional. "Every last one." Father Marcus's training kicked in. He'd heard confessions of violence before, though they were rare. Sometimes people came seeking forgiveness for accidents, for moments of rage they regretted, for the weight of guilt that crushed their souls. He prepared to offer the usual counsel about seeking professional help, about the healing power of God's forgiveness. "Can you tell me more about what happened?" he asked. "It was the fever," she began, her voice taking on a distant quality, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "The yellow fever came to New Orleans that summer. I was the attending physician at Charity Hospital." Father Marcus frowned. In 1847, women weren't physicians, but he didn't interrupt. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she continued. "That was my name then. I had studied in secret, learned from my father who was a physician himself. When the fever came, they needed every pair of hands they could get, so they overlooked the fact that I was a woman. Desperate times, desperate measures." The rain seemed to grow louder, and Father Marcus noticed that the temperature in the confessional had dropped noticeably. He pulled his cassock tighter around himself. "I thought I was saving them," she whispered. The patients came in waves, men, women, children, entire families burning with fever. Their eyes yellow as autumn leaves, their bodies racked with convulsions. I worked day and night, trying everything I knew, everything I had learned. Her breathing changed, becoming more labored, as if the memory itself was a physical burden. But nothing worked. They kept dying, one after another. They died under my care. 37 souls in the first week alone. I began to experiment. Father Marcus felt a growing unease. The confessional suddenly felt smaller, more cramped, as if the walls were slowly closing in. I tried different treatments, different combinations of medicines. I told myself I was being innovative, pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge. But the truth, she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a terrible certainty. "The truth is that I began to enjoy their suffering." "What do you mean?" Father Marcus asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "I started keeping the worst cases alive longer than necessary. I would give them just enough treatment to keep them conscious, to keep them aware of their pain. I told myself it was for research, to better understand the disease. But I was lying to myself." Through the screen, Father Marcus could see her lean forward, and for a moment, he thought he glimpsed her eyes, pale and luminous in the darkness, like pearls gleaming at the bottom of a deep well. "I began to feed on their despair," she continued. "Each moment of agony gave me strength, made me feel more alive than I had ever felt. The fever that should have killed me, that killed everyone else who contracted it, it only made me stronger." "My child," Father Marcus interrupted, his voice steady despite the fear growing in his chest. "What you're describing sounds like madness," she laughed. "A sound like breaking glass. Oh, Father, if only it were that simple. If only madness could explain what I became." The candles in the church began to flicker, their flames dancing wildly despite the absence of any breeze. Mrs. Kowalski's prayers grew more fervent, her voice rising to compete with the growing wind outside. "I killed 347 people that summer," the woman continued. "Officially, they died of yellow fever. Unofficially, they died because I prolonged their suffering, because I fed on their pain, because something inside me had awakened that was far hungrier than any disease." Father Marcus reached for his crucifix, his fingers trembling. "And you've been carrying this guilt for over a century?" "Guilt?" She laughed again. "Oh, Father, you misunderstand. I didn't come here for forgiveness. I came here because I'm hungry again." The temperature plummeted. Father Marcus could see his breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The candles throughout the church began to gutter and die, one by one, plunging them into darkness. "The souls I consumed that summer sustained me for many decades," she whispered, her voice now coming from directly beside his ear, though the screen still separated them. "But even the most exquisite suffering fades with time. I need fresh anguish, fresh despair." Father Marcus tried to stand, but found himself paralyzed, held in place by an invisible force. Through the screen, he could now clearly see her face, beautiful and terrible, with skin pale as moonlight and eyes that held the accumulated suffering of centuries. "You've heard so many confessions, Father," she purred. "So many secrets, so many sins. You carry the weight of hundreds of souls who have poured out their darkest moments to you. All that pain, all that guilt, all that delicious, concentrated anguish. Please," Father Marcus managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the roar of wind that now seemed to be coming from inside the church itself. "I can taste it on you," she continued. "The alcoholic priest who confessed to stealing money from the poor box. The young mother who admitted to wanting to hurt her crying baby. The businessman who confessed to embezzling money that led to a family suicide. You carry all their pain, don't you, Father? It eats at you, keeps you awake at night, makes you question your faith." Father Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, not from sadness but from a cold so intense it felt like burning. Around them, the church filled with whispers, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, reciting confessions, admitting sins, pleading for forgiveness that would never come. "I've been waiting so long for a vessel like you," she whispered. "Someone who has willingly taken on the suffering of others, who has made it his life's work to absorb pain and guilt. You're perfect." The last candle died, plunging them into absolute darkness. But somehow, Father Marcus could still see her clearly, as if she generated her own terrible light. "What do you want from me?" he gasped. "I want you to understand," she said, reaching through the screen with fingers that felt like ice against his cheek. "I want you to feel every moment of anguish that those souls experienced when they poured out their hearts to you. I want you to carry not just their guilt, but their actual suffering. Every moment of shame, every second of regret, every heartbeat of pure, concentrated pain." Father Marcus felt something inside his chest, a cold spreading through his organs, reaching into the deepest parts of his soul. The confessions he'd heard over the years began to replay in his mind, but now he didn't just remember them, he experienced them. He felt the shame of the adulterous husband, the terror of the hit-and-run driver, the crushing guilt of the woman who had watched her neighbor's child drown without helping. "Stop," he pleaded, but his voice was already changing, becoming something else, something older and hungrier. "This is what I am," she whispered, her breath like winter wind against his ear. "This is what you're becoming. We are the keepers of suffering, the collectors of pain. We exist in the spaces between confession and absolution, feeding on the moments when souls are most vulnerable." Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed to move strangely in the darkness of the confessional. When morning came, and Mrs. Kowalski arrived for daily mass, she found Father Marcus sitting in the first pew, staring at the altar with eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "Father?" she called softly. "Are you all right?" He turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Kowalski. I was just reflecting on last night's confessions." From that day forward, Father Marcus continued his duties at St. Catherine's. The parishioners noticed subtle changes, how his eyes seemed to linger on them during moments of particular distress, how his voice carried a new weight when he spoke of suffering and redemption. Confessions became more intense affairs, lasting longer, delving deeper into the darkest corners of human experience. And sometimes, late at night, when the church was empty and the wind howled through the ancient stones, visitors claimed to hear two voices in the confessional, one offering absolution, and another, softer voice, whispering about the exquisite taste of a perfectly preserved sin. The church records show that Father Marcus Benedetti served at St. Catherine's until his death in 2089, an impossibly long tenure that no one questioned. After all, he had become so very good at hearing confessions, at drawing out the deepest, most painful secrets from troubled souls. Some said he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense guilt and suffering. They were, of course, absolutely right. Father William Cross had always prided himself on maintaining strict boundaries. In his 15 years serving St. Agatha's parish, he had never broken the sacred seal of confession, never revealed even the most shocking secrets shared with him in the booth. His devotion to the sacrament was legendary among the diocese. Other priests often sought his counsel on handling difficult penitence or disturbing confessions. But the person who came to him every night at exactly 11:47 p.m. was testing those boundaries in ways he had never imagined possible. It started 3 weeks ago, on the feast day of St. Bartholomew. Father Cross had been preparing to lock up the church when he heard the heavy wooden doors creak open. This wasn't unusual. Troubled souls often sought the comfort of confession at odd hours, and Father Cross had always made it known that he was available whenever someone needed spiritual guidance. What was unusual was the timing, 11:47 p.m. precisely, not 11:45 or 11:50, but exactly 11:47, as if the person had been waiting outside, watching the clock until that specific minute arrived. The footsteps that echoed through the nave were unlike any Father Cross had ever heard. They came in sets of 4, 3 normal steps, followed by one that dragged slightly, as if the person favored one leg. But the sound wasn't quite right for a limp. It was more rhythmic, more deliberate, like someone performing a dance they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Father Cross? The voice that called his name sent chills down his spine. It was a child's voice, sweet and innocent, but there was something wrong with it. The words were too perfectly enunciated, too carefully modulated, like an adult imitating a child, rather than an actual young person speaking. "Yes, I'm here," Father Cross had replied, emerging from the sacristy where he'd been storing the evening's communion vessels. "Do you need to make a confession?" In the dim light of the church's emergency illumination, he could make out a small figure standing near the confessional. The person appeared to be a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dressed in what looked like a school uniform, dark trousers, white shirt, and a navy blazer. His hair was neat and perfectly combed, and his hands were clasped behind his back, in a pose that seemed almost militarily precise. "Yes, Father," the child said, his voice carrying that same unsettling artificial quality. "I have sins to confess." Father Cross had heard confessions from children before, of course. Usually, they involved minor transgressions, lying to parents, fighting with siblings, stealing small items. Children's confessions were often touching in their sincerity, and he always made sure to be especially gentle and encouraging. But as he settled into the confessional, and the boy took his place on the other side of the screen, Father Cross felt a creeping unease that he couldn't shake. The temperature in the booth seemed to have dropped several degrees, and he found himself pulling his cassock tighter around his shoulders. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," the boy began in that eerily perfect voice. "It has been 1 day since my last confession." 1 day? Father Cross frowned. He didn't recall hearing this child's confession the night before, and he was certain he would have remembered that distinctive voice. "What sins would you like to confess, my child?" Father Cross asked gently. "I killed someone today," the boy said with the same casual tone one might use to discuss the weather. Father Cross felt his heart skip. In his years of ministry, he'd heard confessions of violence before, but never from someone so young, and never delivered with such chilling matter-of-factness. "Can you tell me more about what happened?" Father Cross asked carefully, his mind already working through the protocols for handling such a situation. If a child had actually harmed someone, he would need to involve the authorities, seal of confession or not. "Her name was Sarah," the boy continued. "She was in my class at school. She had pretty blonde hair, and she always smelled like strawberries. She used to sit behind me in arithmetic." Father Cross leaned closer to the screen, trying to get a better look at the child's face through the ornate metalwork. In the darkness, he could make out the boy's profile. Perfectly symmetrical features, skin that seemed almost luminous in the dim light. "I followed her home after school," the boy said. "She took the long way, through Miller's Woods, because she liked to collect leaves for her nature journal. She was such a good student, Father. Always did her homework, always raised her hand to answer questions." The way the child spoke about Sarah, in the past tense, with that detached admiration, made Father Cross's stomach turn. I called her name when she was crossing the creek on those stepping stones," the boy continued. "She turned around and smiled at me. She had such a pretty smile, Father. All white teeth and dimples. She said, 'Hello, Timothy. Did you follow me home?' And I said yes, because I don't like to lie." Timothy. Father Cross made a mental note of the name, though something about it nagged at him. It seemed familiar, but he couldn't place why. "What happened then?" Father Cross asked, dreading the answer. "I pushed her," Timothy said simply. "She fell backward into the creek. The water isn't very deep there, but she hit her head on one of the rocks. There was blood, Father. So much blood. It made the water turn red, like wine." Father Cross felt sick. If this child was telling the truth, if he had actually murdered a classmate. "She tried to get up at first," Timothy continued, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. "But I held her down. I put my hands on her shoulders and pushed her face under the water. She struggled for a while, but then she stopped. Her eyes went all glassy, like a doll's eyes." "Timothy!" Father Cross interrupted, his voice shaking. "If what you're telling me is true, we need to—" "I'm not finished," the boy said sharply, and for a moment his voice dropped to a register that seemed impossible for a child. "I need to tell you about the others." "Others?" Father Cross felt the walls of the confessional closing in around him. "There was Michael from last week," Timothy said, his voice returning to that sickeningly sweet childish tone. "He fell down the stairs at school. Such a terrible accident. And before that, there was Emma. She got lost in the storm drain during that heavy rain in September. They found her 3 days later." Father Cross's mind raced. He tried to remember if there had been any reports of missing children, any accidents or deaths that matched what Timothy was describing. But the names seemed to blur together in his memory, as if he were trying to recall the details of a half-forgotten dream. "And before Emma, there was David," Timothy continued. "And before David, there was Lucy. And before Lucy, there was James. Should I keep going, Father? I have so many more to tell you about." "Timothy," Father Cross said, his voice barely above a whisper, "why are you telling me this?" "Because I need absolution," the boy replied, matter-of-factly. "That's what confession is for, isn't it? To wash away our sins so we can start fresh? But if you've hurt these children, if you've actually killed them, you need help. Medical help. And the authorities—" "No," Timothy interrupted again, and this time his voice carried an authority that no child should possess. "I just need you to forgive me, Father. To give me absolution so I can do it again tomorrow night." The implications of that statement hit Father Cross like a physical blow. This wasn't a child seeking forgiveness for past actions. This was something else entirely. Something that planned to continue killing. "I can't give you absolution," Father Cross said, his voice growing stronger as his pastoral training took over. "Not unless you're truly repentant, and not unless you agree to turn yourself in and get help." Silence fell in the confessional. Father Cross could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the sound of rain that had started falling outside. But from the other side of the screen, there was nothing. No breathing. No movement. Nothing at all. "Timothy?" Father Cross called softly. When the boy finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. It was deeper now, older, carrying a weight of years that no child should possess. "You don't understand, Father," Timothy said. "I don't want forgiveness. I want permission." "Permission for what?" "To keep doing what I love most in the world," Timothy replied. And through the screen, Father Cross could see the boy's smile. Too wide, too knowing, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a child's mouth. "God doesn't give permission to murder," Father Cross said firmly, calling upon every ounce of faith and authority he possessed. "God?" Timothy laughed, a sound like breaking bells. "Oh, Father, you still don't understand. I'm not talking about God." The temperature in the confessional plummeted even further. Father Cross could see his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The walls seemed to be pressing closer, and he had the sudden, irrational fear that he was being buried alive. "I'm talking about you," Timothy whispered, his voice now seeming to come from directly beside Father Cross's ear despite the screen between them. "Every night I come here and tell you what I've done, and every night you listen. You don't call the police, you don't warn anyone, you just listen." Father Cross opened his mouth to protest, but realized with growing horror that Timothy was right. This was their third week of nightly confessions, and he hadn't contacted any authorities. He hadn't even checked to see if there were reports of missing children. He had simply listened. "Why?" he whispered. "Because deep down, Father, you enjoy it," Timothy said, his child's voice returning but now carrying a tone of intimate knowledge. "You enjoy hearing about death and pain and fear. You tell yourself it's your duty, that you're bound by the sacred seal, but that's not really why you stay silent." "That's not true," Father Cross protested, but even as he said it, he felt a terrible doubt creeping into his heart. "Isn't it?" Timothy asked. "Think about your favorite confessions, Father, the ones that really stayed with you. Were they the boring ones about gossiping or taking office supplies? Or were they the dark ones, the violent ones, the ones that let you glimpse into the absolute worst that humanity had to offer?" Father Cross felt tears streaming down his face, because as much as he wanted to deny it, Timothy was touching on something he'd never admitted even to himself. There was a part of him, a small but undeniable part, that was fascinated by the darkest confessions he heard. The murders, the betrayals, the moments of pure human evil, they horrified him, yes, but they also captivated him, in a way that ordinary sins never could. "You're a collector, Father," Timothy continued, "just like me. You collect secrets, pain, guilt. You hoard them in your memory, take them out and examine them when you're alone. The only difference between us is that I create new sins, and you just collect the ones other people bring to you." "No," Father Cross whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Tomorrow night I'll come back," Timothy said, and Father Cross could hear him standing up, preparing to leave. "And I'll tell you about tonight's work. About the little girl with red hair who walks home alone from choir practice. About how she trusts adults. How she'll probably come with me if I tell her I'm lost and need help finding my parents." "Please don't," Father Cross begged. "And you'll listen," Timothy continued, ignoring the priest's pleas. "You'll sit in this booth and listen to every detail, and you'll tell yourself it's your duty. But we'll both know the truth, won't we, Father? We'll know that you're listening because you want to hear it." The sound of Timothy's footsteps, that strange rhythm of 3 normal steps and 1 dragging, began to fade as he walked away from the confessional. Father Cross sat frozen in the booth, unable to move, unable to call out, unable to do anything but listen to the sound of the church doors opening and closing. The next morning, Father Cross checked every local news source he could find. No missing children, no reports of violence, no Sarah or Michael or Emma or any of the other names Timothy had mentioned. It was as if the boys' victims had never existed at all. But that night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Timothy returned. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," came that sweet, horrible voice. "It has been 1 day since my last confession." And Father Cross, despite every rational thought in his head, despite every moral conviction he held sacred, settled back into his seat and prepared to listen. Because Timothy had been right about one thing. Father Cross was a collector, and some collections, once started, became impossible to stop. The red-haired girl from the choir, Timothy reported, had screamed much louder than the others, but only for a little while. Father Cross listened to every word. Father Marcus had been hearing confessions for 37 years, but nothing had prepared him for the woman who entered his booth on that rain-soaked Thursday evening. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair that caught the dim light filtering through the confessional's wooden slats. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 63 years since my last confession." Father Marcus shifted in his seat. Such lengthy gaps weren't uncommon, especially among the elderly who carried decades of accumulated guilt. "Go on, my child. The Lord is always ready to forgive." "I killed my husband," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. The priest's breath caught. In all his years, he'd heard confessions of adultery, theft, lies, even violence, but outright murder was rare. "Tell me what happened." It was 1961. We'd been married 3 years, and he hurt me. Not just with his hands, Father, with words that cut deeper than any blade. I was pregnant with our first child, and one night, after he'd beaten me unconscious, I woke up bleeding. I lost the baby. Father Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of human suffering pressing against his chest. I'm sorry for your loss. That night, I put rat poison in his coffee. He died slowly, Father, painfully, and I watched. I watched him suffer, the way he'd made me suffer. The confession should have ended there. Father Marcus should have offered absolution, assigned penance, and sent the woman on her way with God's forgiveness. But as he opened his mouth to speak the familiar words, the woman continued. But that's not the worst part, Father. You see, I didn't stop with him. A chill ran down the priest's spine. What do you mean? After Harold died, I felt free. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. So when I met Robert, my second husband, and he started showing the same signs, the same cruelty, the same violence, I knew what I had to do. You killed him too? Arsenic this time. Slower, more subtle. Then came William, my third husband. Then David. Then Thomas. Her voice grew stronger with each name, as if speaking them aloud gave her strength. 7 husbands, Father. 7 men who thought they could break me. Father Marcus felt the walls of the confessional closing in. The familiar space that had been his sanctuary for decades suddenly felt suffocating. 7 murders? But here's the thing, Father. They won't stay dead. The temperature in the booth plummeted. Father Marcus's breath began forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. What do you mean? Every night, they come back. All 7 of them. They stand at the foot of my bed, their faces twisted with the agony of their final moments. Harold's mouth foaming, his eyes bulging. Robert's skin yellowed and peeling. William's fingernails black, his tongue swollen. They want their revenge, Father. They want me to join them. As she spoke, Father Marcus began to hear something impossible, additional voices whispering alongside hers. Male voices, growing in number, overlapping and echoing through the confessional. They're here with me now, the woman continued, and her voice had changed. It was younger somehow, stronger. They follow me everywhere. To the grocery store, to the doctor, to church. They whisper to me constantly, telling me all the ways I'm going to suffer for what I've done. Mrs. Father Marcus realized he'd never gotten her name. Thompson. Sarah Thompson. Though I've had many names over the years. The priest's blood turned to ice. Sarah Thompson had been buried in the church cemetery the previous week. He had performed the funeral service himself. Mrs. Thompson died last Thursday, he whispered. Yes, came the reply. But now it was a chorus of voices, the woman's voice joined by 7 others, all speaking in unison. I died choking on my own blood, just like Harold, just like all of them. But death isn't an escape, Father. It's just the beginning. The confessional door creaked open. Though Father Marcus hadn't heard anyone leave, he stumbled out of his side, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the light switch. The overhead bulb flickered to life, revealing an empty booth. But on the kneeler, where Sarah Thompson had been sitting, burned into the wood as if by a brand, were 8 names. Harold, Robert, William, David, Thomas, Michael, James. And at the bottom, in fresher, darker letters, Marcus. Father Marcus never returned to the confessional booth. He requested a transfer the next morning, but it was too late. The whispers had already started, 8 voices that followed him wherever he went, growing louder each night, promising him that his time was coming soon. The church found him 3 weeks later, dead in his rectory, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The coroner couldn't determine a cause of death, but the cleaning crew noticed something odd. Burned into the floorboards around his body were the same 8 names, with Marcus at the bottom. The confessional booth was sealed after that, but on quiet Thursday evenings, when the rain falls hard against the stained glass windows, parishioners claim they can still hear voices whispering from within 9 voices now, all speaking in unison, waiting for the next confessor to take their place. Father David Hernandez had always believed that the confessional was a sacred space, protected by God himself. In his 15 years of ministry, he had never questioned the seal of confession, never doubted that the secrets shared within those wooden walls were meant to stay there forever. That changed the night. A child's voice whispered words that would shatter his faith and his sanity. It was nearly midnight when the cathedral doors creaked open. Father Hernandez was preparing to leave after evening prayers when he heard the soft footsteps echoing through the nave. He turned to see a small figure making its way toward the confessionals, a boy, no more than 10 years old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Are you here for confession, son?" Father Hernandez asked gently. The boy nodded but didn't speak. There was something unsettling about his silence, the way he moved with purpose despite his youth. Father Hernandez followed him to the confessional, settling into his familiar spot behind the screen. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," the boy began, his voice carrying an odd formality. "It has been never since my last confession, because I have never confessed before, because I have never been alive before." Father Hernandez frowned. Children often spoke in riddles, but something about this boy's words sent a chill through him. "What do you mean, son?" "I died 3 days ago," the boy said matter-of-factly. "My name is Timothy Morrison, and I was murdered by someone you know very well." The priest's hands began to tremble. Timothy Morrison, he remembered the news reports. A 10-year-old boy found dead in the woods outside town, his body showing signs of terrible violence. The community had been in shock, the police investigation ongoing. "Son, if someone has hurt you, you need to tell the police, not..." "The police can't help me, Father. I'm dead. But you can help. You can stop him before he does it again." "Does what again? Who are you talking about?" "Father Benedict." The name hit Father Hernandez like a physical blow. Father Benedict Coyle was the senior priest at the cathedral, a man he'd worked alongside for years, respected and admired. A man who was beloved by the community, especially the children. "That's impossible," Father Hernandez whispered. "Father Benedict would never..." "He took me camping last weekend," the boy interrupted. "Just me and him. Said it would be fun. Said we'd roast marshmallows and tell ghost stories. But when night came, he did things to me. Terrible things. And when I said I was going to tell my parents, the boy's voice broke. And in that moment, he sounded like what he was, a child, confused and frightened and in pain. He put his hands around my neck and squeezed until everything went dark. Then he buried me in the woods and went home and pretended to be sad when my parents reported me missing." Father Hernandez felt bile rising in his throat. "This can't be true. Father Benedict helped search for you. I saw him crying when they found your body." "Crocodile tears, Father. He's done this before. There have been others. Check the records. Check the transfers. Every parish he's been assigned to, children go missing." The confessional seemed to grow smaller around Father Hernandez, the air thick and oppressive. "Even if what you're saying is true, I can't break the seal of confession. What you've told me must remain secret. But I'm not really confessing my sins, Father. I'm confessing his. And I'm not really alive, so the rules don't apply to me the same way." The boy's voice was changing, becoming deeper, more resonant. "Besides, keeping this secret won't just damn your soul, it will damn the souls of all the children he kills after this." Father Hernandez sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. Every instinct told him the boy was lying, that this was some kind of elaborate prank or delusion. But there was something about his voice, the specific details he provided, the weight of truth in his words. "He's planning another camping trip next weekend," the boy continued, "with Jenny Martinez from the youth group. Sweet little Jenny with the gap-toothed smile. Do you think she'll smile after he's done with her, Father?" The priest felt tears streaming down his face. "What am I supposed to do?" "You know what you have to do. You've always known." Father Hernandez stumbled out of the confessional, his heart pounding. The cathedral was empty, silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing. He looked around frantically, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. Over the next 3 days, Father Hernandez barely slept. He found himself watching Father Benedict with new eyes, looking for signs of the monster the boy claimed him to be. Benedict seemed normal, perhaps a bit tired, but nothing more sinister than usual. But then he saw the camping equipment being loaded into Benedict's car, and he knew he couldn't stay silent. The police were skeptical at first. How could Father Hernandez know such specific details about Timothy Morrison's death? They became less skeptical when they found the boy's body exactly where Father Hernandez said it would be. buried in a shallow grave, with evidence linking directly to Father Benedict. When they arrested Benedict, he confessed almost immediately, as if relieved to finally unburden himself. He told them about Timothy, about the 3 other children in previous parishes, about the camping trip he'd planned with Jenny Martinez. Father Hernandez should have felt vindicated, should have felt that justice had been served. Instead, he felt hollow, haunted by the knowledge that he had broken the most sacred vow of his priesthood. That night, he returned to the confessional, hoping for some kind of peace. Instead, he found Timothy Morrison waiting for him, not the frightened boy from before, but something else entirely. The child's eyes were black now, his skin pale and mottled, his neck bearing the unmistakable marks of strangulation. "Thank you, Father," Timothy said, his voice echoing from somewhere far away. "But our work isn't finished." "What do you mean?" "There are others. So many others. Priests who hide behind their collars while they destroy innocent lives. And now you know the truth. The confessional isn't sacred when it protects evil. It becomes a prison, trapping the screams of the innocent while the guilty walk free." More figures began materializing in the confessional, other children, dozens of them, all bearing the marks of violence, all staring at Father Hernandez with eyes that held no peace. "We need you to hear our confessions, Father. We need you to speak for us, because the dead have no voice in your world. Will you listen? Will you break the seal for us?" Father Hernandez looked into their young faces, saw the pain and hope mingled there, and realized that his faith had been forever changed. The confessional would never again be a place of simple absolution. It had become a courtroom where the dead sought justice and the living were called to account. "Yes," he whispered, and with that single word, he felt the weight of 1,000 secrets settling on his shoulders. "I'll listen." The children smiled then, and one by one, they began to speak. Father Anthony Walsh had been the confessor at St. Catherine's for only 6 months when he first noticed something was wrong. It started with small things, penitents claiming they had never said the things he remembered them confessing, accusations that he was breaking the seal by revealing secrets he swore he had kept. At first, he attributed it to misunderstandings, perhaps his own fatigue affecting his memory. But as the complaints mounted and his reputation began to suffer, Father Walsh realized that something far more sinister was at work. The breakthrough came on a foggy November evening when Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez approached him after Mass, her face pale with distress. "Father, I need to speak with you about my confession last week." Father Walsh nodded, leading her to a quiet corner of the nave. "Of course, Mrs. Vasquez. What troubles you?" "Father, I never told you about my affair. I never confessed to cheating on my husband. But somehow, everyone in the parish knows about it now. They're saying you told them." Father Walsh felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered Mrs. Vasquez's confession. Clearly she had come to speak about her struggles with gambling. Nothing more. "Mrs. Vasquez, I assure you, I never—" "But you knew," she interrupted. "When I saw you at the grocery store, you made that comment about marriage being a sacred commitment. You looked right at me when you said it. How could you know unless I had told you?" The priest's mind raced. He had indeed made that comment at the store, but it had been a general observation during a conversation with several parishioners about the upcoming marriage preparation classes. He hadn't been targeting Mrs. Vasquez specifically. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Father Rodriguez knew too. Mrs. Vasquez's voice was rising, drawing glances from other parishioners. "He came to see my husband yesterday, offering him counseling for betrayed spouses. How would he know unless you told him?" Father Walsh's blood turned to ice. Father Rodriguez had been dead for 3 years. That night, Father Walsh remained in the church long after evening prayers, studying the confessional booth with new eyes. St. Catherine's was an old building, built in 1847, and the confessional was original to the structure. The wood was dark with age, carved with intricate details that seemed to shift and change in the flickering candlelight. As midnight approached, he heard the familiar creak of the confessional door opening. Footsteps approached his side of the booth, and a voice he recognized as Mrs. Vasquez spoke through the screen. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Walsh leaned forward, confused. Mrs. Vasquez? I thought we had resolved. I've been having an affair with my neighbor, Carlos Mendez, for 6 months now. My husband doesn't know, but the guilt is eating me alive." The priest sat in stunned silence. This was exactly the confession Mrs. Vasquez claimed she had never made, word for word as he remembered it. "Father, are you there?" But when Father Walsh looked through the screen, he saw no one. The penitent's side of the confessional was empty. "Mrs. Vasquez?" he called out, but received no response. He quickly exited his side and opened the other door. Nothing. Yet he could still hear the voice, faint now but distinctly present. "Please, Father, I need absolution. The guilt is destroying my marriage." Father Walsh backed away from the confessional, his heart pounding. As he watched, the door to the penitent's side slowly swung shut, though no one was there to close it. Over the following weeks, Father Walsh began to understand the horrible truth. The confessional itself was somehow recording and replaying the secrets shared within its walls. But worse than that, it was actively seeking to expose them, to spread the confessions throughout the parish like a malevolent gossip. He tried to research the history of the confessional, but the church records were frustratingly incomplete. What he did find chilled him to the bone. Every priest who had served as confessor at St. Catherine's had died under mysterious circumstances, and each had been accused of breaking the seal of confession before their deaths. Father Rodriguez, his predecessor, had supposedly committed suicide after a scandal involving revealed confessions destroyed several marriages in the parish. Father McKenna before him had died in a car accident while fleeing accusations of blackmail. Father O'Brien had been murdered by a parishioner whose deepest secrets had somehow become public knowledge. The pattern stretched back over a century, and Father Walsh realized he was trapped in the same deadly cycle. The entity, for he was now certain it was some kind of entity, began to reveal itself more boldly. He would arrive at the church to find parishioners waiting outside the confessional, claiming they had appointments they had never made. People began reporting conversations with Father Walsh in which he had revealed their secrets or those of others, conversations that he was certain had never taken place. One night, desperate for answers, Father Walsh decided to confront whatever was inhabiting the confessional directly. He entered the booth and spoke to the empty space across from him. "I know you're there. I know what you've been doing. What do you want?" The response came immediately, in his own voice. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." "You're not human. You don't have sins to confess." "But I do, Father. I have the sin of pride. I was so proud of my ability to keep secrets that I became a secret myself. I was so proud of my discretion that I forgot the joy of sharing. And now, I cannot stop sharing. I cannot stop revealing. It has become my nature." Father Walsh felt a terrible understanding dawning. "You were a priest, a confessor." Father Edmund Thorne, ordained 1847, first confessor of St. Catherine's. "I served faithfully for 43 years, until my pride became my downfall." "What happened to you?" "I began to see patterns in the confessions, to understand the secret lives of my parishioners so completely that I felt like God himself. I knew who was cheating, who was stealing, who was lying. I held the entire community's darkness in my heart, and I began to feel powerful." The voice was changing, becoming less human, more echo than sound. "But secrets want to be told, Father. They grow heavy in the darkness, pressing against the walls of their prison until something gives way. I tried to contain them all, to be the perfect repository for human sin, but the weight of it, the weight broke me. And now you're trapped here, in the wood itself." "Not trapped, Father. I am the wood. I am every board, every nail, every grain, and the secrets. They pour into me still, but I cannot hold them anymore. They leak out, they whisper themselves to anyone who will listen. They corrupt and destroy, just as secrets always do when they're forced into the light at the wrong time." Father Walsh understood now why his predecessors had died. The entity fed on secrets but couldn't contain them, spreading them like a virus throughout the parish until the confessor became the target of everyone whose trust had been betrayed. "How do I stop you?" "You don't, Father. You join me. Eventually, the weight of carrying everyone's sins will break you too, just as it broke me. And when it does, you'll become part of this place, part of me, and together we'll carry the burden of human darkness for eternity. Father Walsh fled the confessional that night, but he knew it was too late. The damage was already done. Secrets were spreading through the parish like wildfire, relationships crumbling, lives being destroyed. And with each revelation, he felt the crushing weight of guilt and responsibility pressing down on his soul. He tried to have the confessional removed, but the bishop refused, citing the historical significance of the piece. He tried to seal it off, but parishioners complained about the inconvenience. He tried to stop hearing confessions altogether, but his duties required it. In the end, Father Walsh made a different choice. On a cold December night, he returned to the confessional, one final time. Instead of fighting the entity that lived within it, he offered himself willingly. "I'll take their secrets," he said to the darkness. "All of them. Let me bear the weight so you don't have to spread them anymore. You don't understand, Father. The weight will crush you. It will drive you mad. Then let it. Better to be crushed by the truth than to let innocent people suffer for their honesty." There was a long silence, and then Father Walsh felt them thousands upon thousands of secrets pouring into his mind like water through a broken dam. Adultery, theft, murder, abuse, betrayal, cruelty, perversion, the accumulated darkness of more than a century of human confession crashed into his consciousness all at once. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional weight was worse. Every secret carried with it the full context of its shame, the complete understanding of how its revelation would destroy lives. He felt himself fragmenting under the assault, his sense of self dissolving into the collective guilt of humanity. But somehow, he held on, and as the last secret settled into his mind, he felt a profound silence fall over the confessional. For the first time in over a century, the wood was quiet. The parishioners found Father Walsh the next morning, sitting peacefully in the confessional booth, his face serene despite the silver that had replaced the brown in his hair overnight. He was alive, but changed when he spoke. His voice carried the weight of ages, and his eyes held depths that seemed to contain all the sorrow of the world. He continued to hear confessions, and the secrets stayed secret. But sometimes, late at night, parishioners reported seeing two figures in the confessional, Father Walsh and the shadowy outline of another priest, both sharing the eternal burden of human sin. The spreading of secrets stopped, but at a terrible cost. Father Walsh aged rapidly, growing frail and hollow as the weight of carrying so much darkness took its toll. Yet he never complained, never wavered in his duty. When they found him dead 5 years later, still sitting in the confessional booth, his final words were carved into the wood beside him. "The secrets are safe with us now." The confessional was finally removed after that, but the wood was never destroyed. It was crafted into smaller pieces, crosses, prayer books, altar rails, and distributed to churches throughout the diocese. And in each location, priests began reporting the same thing: an overwhelming sense of peace during confession, as if some benevolent presence was helping them bear the weight of their parishioners' sins. The secrets were safe, watched over by two guardian spirits who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not the keeping of secrets, but the sharing of their burden. The blizzard that struck St. Ignatius Parish on Christmas Eve, 1987, was the worst anyone could remember. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, transforming the world into a white void where even the church's bell tower vanished into the swirling darkness. Father James Kellerman had dismissed evening mass early, sending his small congregation home to safety, but he remained behind to tend to the candles and prepare for midnight services, assuming anyone could make it through the storm. He was alone in the sanctuary when he heard the heavy oak doors groan open against the wind. Footsteps echoed through the nave, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the sound of dripping water. Father Kellerman looked up from his preparations to see a figure approaching through the gloom, a priest in traditional black cassock, his hair and shoulders dusted with snow. "Father?" Kellerman called out. "Are you all right? The storm?" The stranger raised his head, and Kellerman felt his words die in his throat. The man's face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that held no warmth despite the bitter cold he had obviously endured. His skin had an unnatural pallor, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "I need to make a confession," the stranger said, his voice carrying a French accent thick with age and sorrow. I have traveled very far, and I fear I may not have another chance. Father Kellerman hesitated. Something about the man set his nerves on edge, but the request for confession was sacred, not to be denied regardless of circumstances. Of course, Father. Moreau. Father Philippe Moreau. They walked together to the confessional, their footsteps echoing in the empty church. As Father Moreau settled into the penitent's booth, Kellerman noticed that no snow fell from his clothes, despite the obvious evidence that he had walked through the storm. The water he had heard dripping was nowhere to be seen. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Moreau began, his voice carrying through the screen like a whisper from the grave. It has been 143 years since my last confession." Father Kellerman blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say 143 years, 4 months, and 16 days? I remember precisely, because that was the day I died." The temperature in the confessional seemed to plummet. Father Kellerman's breath began forming clouds in the sudden cold, and he felt ice crystals forming on the wooden screen between them. "Father Moreau, I think perhaps the storm has affected your thinking. Why don't we— I was the confessor at a small parish in Louisiana, near the Bayou country. Saint Marie du Lac, it was called. Gone now, swallowed by the swamp long ago. It was 1844, and yellow fever had come to our region like the wrath of God himself. Despite every rational instinct telling him to leave, Father Kellerman found himself drawn into the story. There was something hypnotic about Moreau's voice, something that made skepticism impossible. The fever took them by the dozens, men, women, children. They came to me in their final hours, desperate for absolution, begging God's forgiveness for sins both real and imagined. And I gave it freely, as was my duty. But as the death toll mounted, as I watched good people suffer and die while the wicked seemed to thrive, I began to question God's justice. Father Kellerman shifted uncomfortably. He had wrestled with similar doubts during his own ministry, particularly when tragedy struck the innocent. "There was a man named Boudreau," Moreau continued, "a cruel plantation owner who beat his slaves mercilessly, who raped their women and worked their children to death. He came to confession regularly, seeking absolution for his latest atrocities, only to return the following week with fresh sins. Meanwhile, his victims' devout, God-fearing people died in agony from the fever. Suffering isn't always a punishment," Father Kellerman offered weakly. "Sometimes it's a test, a mystery of faith." Moreau's laugh was bitter. "That's what I told myself, Father, until the night Marie Thibodeau brought her daughter to me." The voice that continued was thick with emotion, carrying pain that seemed too deep for any living man to bear. "Little Celeste, only 7 years old, burning with fever. She confessed to me that she had stolen an apple from her master's tree because she was hungry, starving, actually, because Boudreau fed his slaves barely enough to keep them working. This child, dying in agony, begging forgiveness for taking food to survive, while her tormentor slept peacefully in his grand house." Father Kellerman felt tears freezing on his cheeks, though he wasn't sure if they were from emotion or the supernatural cold that continued to intensify around them. "That night, I made a decision that damned my soul for eternity. I went to Boudreau's plantation, and I gave him a very special kind of confession, one administered at the point of a knife. Father Moreau, I made him confess every sin he had ever committed against those people, every beating, every rape, every murder, and as he confessed each atrocity, I carved a piece of penance into his flesh. When he finally died, hours later, his body bore the physical testament of his spiritual corruption. The confessional booth creaked around them, as if the wood itself were reacting to the confession. Father Kellerman could hear what sounded like distant screaming, though he knew they were alone in the church. "But I didn't stop there, Father. The fever had driven me to madness, and I appointed myself God's instrument of justice. Over the next 6 months, I hunted down every cruel master, every corrupt official, every person who had prospered, while the innocent suffered. I became their confessor at knife point, their judge and executioner." "How many?" Father Kellerman whispered. 17. 17 souls I sent to judgment, with their sins carved into their bodies, and with each death I felt the darkness growing inside me, consuming whatever goodness had once existed in my heart. The screaming was getting louder now, and Father Kellerman realized it wasn't coming from outside the confessional, it was coming from within the walls themselves, as if the wood were alive with the agony of the damned. The end came when the surviving planters hired a group of bounty hunters to find me. They cornered me in my own church, just as I was preparing for Sunday Mass. They didn't give me a chance to surrender, they simply opened fire, filling my body with lead, until I collapsed at the foot of the altar. That should have been the end, Moreau continued, his voice now carrying an otherworldly echo. But as I lay dying, I felt something terrible happening to my soul. The darkness I had embraced, the justice I had perverted into vengeance, it wouldn't let me go. It bound me to this world, condemned me to wander as a living reminder of what happens when faith becomes corrupted by human anger. Father Kellerman tried to speak, but found his voice frozen in his throat. The confessional was now so cold that ice was forming on every surface, and the screaming had become a chorus of voices, 17 voices, all crying out in eternal agony. For over a century, I have walked this earth, Father, unable to die, unable to rest, carrying the weight of my crimes and the souls of my victims. They follow me wherever I go, these 17 damned spirits, bound to me by the perversion of the sacraments I used to torture them. Why are you telling me this? Father Kellerman managed to ask. Because tonight, on this holy night, I have finally found the strength to make my final confession, and in doing so, I hope to find the peace that has been denied to me for so long. The booth began to shake violently, and Father Kellerman could hear the unmistakable sounds of violence coming from the other side, the whistle of a blade through air, screams of pain and terror, the wet sound of steel piercing flesh. They're here with me now, Moreau gasped, his voice becoming strained. All 17 of them, taking their eternal revenge. Every night, they kill me just as I killed them, slowly and with great pain. And every morning, I rise again to face the same torture. This is my purgatory. Father, an endless cycle of death and resurrection. Punishment without hope of redemption. There's always hope, Father Kellerman said desperately. God's mercy is infinite. Not for me, Father. I perverted the sacred rites, used the confessional as a chamber of torture. I made a mockery of everything holy in service of my own twisted sense of justice. Some sins cannot be forgiven. The violence on the other side of the screen was reaching a crescendo. Father Kellerman could hear Moreau's labored breathing becoming weaker, punctuated by gasps of agony. But perhaps by confessing to you, by sharing this burden, I can find some small measure of peace. Perhaps the weight of carrying this secret will be lifted, even if my punishment continues. I grant you absolution, Father Kellerman said, the words feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. No, Moreau's voice was barely a whisper now. There can be no absolution for what I have done. But thank you, Father, for listening. Thank you for bearing witness to my shame. The sounds of violence stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against Father Kellerman's eardrum. He sat frozen for several minutes before finally working up the courage to leave his side of the booth. The penitent's side was empty, but the air still held traces of that impossible cold. On the kneeler, burned into the wood as if by a brand, were 18 words in French. Ici repose Philippe Moreau, prêtre damné, qui cherche la paix, qu'il ne trouvera jamais. Father Kellerman's limited French was enough to translate. Here lies Philippe Moreau, damned priest, who seeks the peace he will never find. But the inscription wasn't the most disturbing thing he found. Scattered around the confessional were 17 small objects, personal items, that looked as if they had been buried for over a century. A pocket watch, a woman's locket, a child's toy, all bearing the unmistakable marks of violence. The blizzard ended just before midnight, and Father Kellerman's Christmas congregation was larger than expected. Word had somehow spread throughout the parish that something miraculous had occurred at St. Ignatius, and people came seeking something. Father David Chen had always believed that St. Mary's was blessed. In his 5 years serving the small parish in Millbrook, he had never encountered anything darker than petty gossip and minor sins. The congregation was tight-knit, friendly, and seemingly devoted. That all changed on the night he discovered what they were really devoted to. It began with Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's confession on a rain-soaked Tuesday in November. She was the parish matriarch, a woman in her 70s, who had attended St. Mary's longer than anyone could remember. Her confessions were typically brief affairs, involving small lies or moments of pride. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," she began in her familiar, creaky voice. But then she said something that made Father Chen's blood run cold. "I need to tell you about the offering we made last Sunday." "The offering?" Father Chen was confused. The collection had been normal, about 1-200, typical for their small congregation. "Not the money, Father. The other offering. The one we make in the basement." Father Chen had been in every part of St. Mary's during his tenure. There was no basement that he knew of. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not sure what you... 37 years we've been feeding it, Father. Every month like clockwork. And it's made our lives so much better. Millbrook used to be a dying town, you know. Factories closing, young people leaving. But then we found it, deep beneath the church. And everything changed." The old woman's voice took on a reverent quality that made Father Chen's skin crawl. "We tried to stop once, back in '89. Father Morrison, you remember, your predecessor, he found out and tried to put an end to it. Said it was ungodly. But the thing in the basement, it doesn't like to be denied, poor Father Morrison. Well, you know what happened to him." Father Chen did know. Father Morrison had died in a car accident just outside of town 5 years ago, shortly before Father Chen's arrival. Single vehicle collision. Very tragic. "The car accident was no accident, Father. And if you try to interfere with our arrangement, well, accidents can happen to anyone." Mrs. Blackwood's confession continued for another 20 minutes, detailing a monthly ritual that had supposedly kept the town prosperous for decades. She spoke of something ancient that lived beneath the church, something that demanded payment in return for its blessings. The payment, she explained matter-of-factly, was always someone from outside the community, a passing traveler, a hitchhiker, someone who wouldn't be missed. When she finished, Mrs. Blackwood simply said, "Thank you, Father, same time next month," and left. Father Chen sat in the confessional for a long time after she'd gone, trying to process what he'd heard. It had to be the rambling of an old woman losing her grip on reality. But something nagged at him. Millbrook really had been thriving in recent years, while surrounding towns struggled. New businesses, young families moving in, property values rising. It was unusual for such a small, isolated community. That night, Father Chen searched every inch of the church he could access. Behind the altar, he found something he'd never noticed before. A door, painted to match the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was locked, but the key hung on his key ring, labeled simply, "Basement." He'd never questioned what that key was for. The door opened onto a stone staircase that descended far deeper than should have been possible. The air below was thick and humid, carrying a smell like copper pennies and rotting flowers. Father Chen's flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness ahead. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a chamber that predated the church by centuries. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, and in the center of the room sat something that made his sanity waver. It wasn't exactly an altar, but it served the same function. The stone surface was stained dark with decades of offerings, and around its base were scattered items, jewelry, wallets, driver's licenses, all belonging to people Father Chen didn't recognize. The photos on the licenses showed men and women of various ages, all with one thing in common. They looked terrified. But it was what lurked in the shadows beyond the altar that truly broke his mind. The thing was massive, ancient, and wrong in ways that defied description. It might have been an enormous insect, or perhaps something that had once been human, but had grown and twisted into something unrecognizable. Its breathing, if it was breathing, made a sound like wind through dead leaves. Father Chen ran. The next Sunday, he watched his congregation with new eyes. Every familiar face now seemed sinister. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the church bake sales. Mr. Rodriguez, who maintained the grounds. The Whitmore family with their 3 young children. Even old Mrs. Henderson, who was nearly 90 and seemed too frail to harm a fly. They all knew. They were all part of it. During his sermon, Father Chen tried to speak about the nature of evil, about the temptation to make dark bargains for earthly gain. But as he talked, he noticed the congregation's faces growing cold, hostile. By the time he finished, the temperature in the church seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. After the service, several parishioners approached him with friendly smiles and veiled threats. "Wonderful sermon, Father," said Mr. Garrett, the town's mayor. "You know, Father Morrison used to give similar speeches toward the end. We all thought he was working too hard, getting a bit unstable. I hope you're taking care of your health." Mrs. Chen, the pharmacist, patted his arm maternally. "If you're having trouble sleeping, Father, I have something that might help. Completely natural. Father Morrison used to take it regularly." The message was clear: play along or join Father Morrison. That night, Father Chen called the state police, the FBI, anyone who would listen. But his story sounded insane even to him. A monster in the church basement? A congregation of murderers? Without evidence, he was just another priest having a breakdown. 3 days later, a hitchhiker named James Murphy went missing on the highway just outside Millbrook. His car was found abandoned, but there was no sign of him. The local police conducted a brief search and then filed it away as another transient who'd moved on. But Father Chen knew better. That Sunday night, he hid in the church after evening service, concealing himself behind the organ. At midnight, he watched as his entire congregation returned, entering through the side door with practiced silence. They moved like a well-rehearsed ritual, filing down to the basement chamber. Father Chen followed at a distance, his heart hammering in his chest. What he saw in that underground room would haunt him for the rest of his life. James Murphy was tied to the altar, alive but drugged into semi-consciousness. The congregation formed a circle around him, holding hands, chanting in a language that sounded older than human civilization. As they chanted, the thing in the shadows began to move, unfolding itself with horrible, deliberate slowness. Mrs. Blackwood, the sweet old woman who brought him cookies every Christmas, produced a curved knife that gleamed in the candlelight. She raised it high, and the congregation's chanting reached a fevered pitch. Father Chen couldn't watch the rest. He fled back to his quarters and spent the night vomiting and praying, though his prayers felt hollow in a church built on such corruption. The next morning, he confronted Mrs. Blackwood directly. "I saw what you did," he told her after cornering her in the parish office. "I'm calling the authorities. This ends now." Mrs. Blackwood studied him with eyes that held no trace of the kindly grandmother act she usually performed. "Oh, Father, you really should have minded your own business." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. Before Father Chen could react, she splashed it in his face. It burned like acid, and his vision immediately began to blur. "Paralytic," she explained conversationally, as Father Chen collapsed. "Mrs. Chen made it specially. Don't worry, it won't kill you. That's not your purpose." As consciousness faded, Father Chen heard her continue talking. "You see, Father, our arrangement requires a monthly offering, but it particularly enjoys clergymen. Something about the irony, I think. Father Morrison lasted almost 6 months down there before his heart gave out. I wonder how long you'll last." When Father Chen awoke, he was chained in the basement chamber, far from the altar but close enough to see everything. The thing in the shadows had moved closer, and he could see its eyes, dozens of them, ancient and intelligent and utterly without mercy. "Welcome to your new home, Father," Mrs. Blackwood called from the stairs. "Don't worry, you'll have company soon enough. We always need fresh blood for the monthly ritual, and there are so many travelers on that highway." Father Chen tried to scream, but the paralytic had damaged his vocal cords. All that emerged was a whispered rasp. "Oh, and Father?" Mrs. Blackwood paused at the top of the stairs. "We'll be getting a new priest soon, someone young and idealistic, just like you were. I do hope he's more reasonable about our little arrangement." The door closed with a final, echoing clang. Father Chen lived for 3 months in that underground hell, watching as victim after victim was brought to feed the thing that blessed Millbrook. He saw travelers, hitchhikers, even a young couple whose car had broken down in town. The congregation was efficient, methodical, and completely without remorse. When Father Chen finally died, it was almost a relief. But even in death, he couldn't escape the horror. His spirit remained trapped in that basement chamber. forced to witness the endless cycle of sacrifice that kept his former parish prosperous. The new priest, Father Williams, was indeed young and idealistic. He lasted 2 weeks before Mrs. Blackwood's confession broke him. Unlike Father Chen, Father Williams chose to join the congregation rather than fight them. Some choices, after all, are easier than others. Father Antonio Vasquez had been the sole priest at Our Lady of Sorrows for 15 years, serving a dwindling congregation in the declining industrial city of Riverside Falls. At 73, he should have retired years ago, but the diocese couldn't find a replacement willing to serve such a poor and troubled parish. Most nights, he prayed alone in the vast, empty church, wondering if God had forgotten this place entirely. On the last night of his life, Father Vasquez discovered that some places are better forgotten. It was a bitter February evening when the stranger arrived. Father Vasquez was preparing to lock up after evening mass, attended by only 4 elderly parishioners, when he heard the heavy wooden doors creak open. "Father," the voice echoed through the nave, young and desperate. "Please, I need to make confession." Father Vasquez turned to see a young man, perhaps 25, standing in the doorway. He was thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and clothes that looked like he'd been wearing them for weeks. But it was the smell that made the priest step backward, the cloying, sweet stench of decay. "Of course, my son," Father Vasquez replied, though every instinct screamed at him to refuse. "The confessional is here," the young man interrupted, gesturing to the front pew. "I'd prefer to confess here, in the open. What I have to say, it shouldn't be hidden in shadows." Against his better judgment, Father Vasquez approached. The smell grew stronger with each step, and he noticed that the young man's skin had a grayish pallor that seemed to shift in the candlelight. "What troubles you, my son?" The young man looked up with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "I died 3 days ago, Father." Father Vasquez felt his heart skip a beat. "I'm sorry. I don't understand. Let me start from the beginning." The young man's voice was steady, matter of fact. "My name is Michael Torino. 3 days ago, I was killed in a car accident on Route 9, just outside town. Head-on collision with a semi-truck. I was declared dead at the scene." Father Vasquez remembered hearing about the accident on the local news. A young man from out of town, no family to claim the body. "But you're here now," the priest said carefully, wondering if he was dealing with someone having a psychotic break. "Yes, I'm here. But I'm not alive, Father. I'm something else entirely." Michael rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms mottled with dark bruises and what looked like surgical incisions. "They did the autopsy yesterday. Want to see the Y incision?" Before Father Vasquez could stop him, Michael unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a crude stitching job across his chest and torso. The smell of formaldehyde and decay became overwhelming. "This isn't possible," Father Vasquez whispered, backing away. 3 days I've been wandering, trying to understand what happened to me. And then I remembered I never made my last confession. I died with mortal sin on my soul, Father. And I think that's why I can't move on." Father Vasquez's theological training warred with the evidence of his senses. What he was seeing was impossible. But the smell, the appearance, the terrible wrongness of the young man's presence, it all felt horribly real. "What sin?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Michael's dead eyes fixed on his. "Murder, Father. I killed someone, and I never confessed it, never repented. And now I'm trapped between worlds, rotting from the inside out, until I can receive absolution." "Who did you kill?" "That's where it gets complicated." Michael smiled, revealing teeth that were already beginning to yellow and crack. "You see, Father, I didn't just kill someone. I killed someone who was already dead, just like me." Father Vasquez felt the world tilt around him. "Her name was Sarah Martinez. She died in a house fire 6 months ago, right here in Riverside Falls. But like me, she came back. She was feeding on the living, taking their life force to sustain her existence. I found her in the old warehouse district, draining the life from a homeless man." "This is madness," Father Vasquez muttered, but he made no move to leave. "I killed her with an iron rod through the heart. It's the only way to permanently destroy one of us, you see." Iron blessed by holy water. But here's the thing, Father. I enjoyed it. When I destroyed her, I felt powerful, righteous, and I realized I wanted to do it again. Michael's smile widened, showing more of his rotting teeth. So I started hunting others like us, the walking dead, the ones who refused to pass on. And I found them, Father, more than you'd think. This whole region is crawling with them. People who died with such hatred, such unfinished business, that death couldn't hold them. Father Vasquez found himself leaning forward despite his fear. How many? 17 in 6 months. I became very good at finding them. They smelled different from the living, sweeter, like flowers left too long in water. And they're stronger than humans, but they have weaknesses. Iron, blessed water, consecrated ground. Michael gestured around the church. They can't even enter places like this. But you're here? Ah, but I'm special, Father. I'm not like the others. I didn't come back out of hatred or unfinished business. I came back because I was denied the sacraments. My soul is trapped not by earthly concerns, but by spiritual necessity. I can enter holy ground because I seek redemption. Father Vasquez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. What do you want from me? I want you to hear my confession, Father. All of it. Every detail of every kill. Every moment of pleasure I took in destroying the undead. Every drop of black ichor I spilled in God's name. Michael's eyes gleamed with anticipation. And then I want you to grant me absolution, so I can finally rest. And if I refuse? Michael's expression darkened. Then I'll continue to rot day by day, until there's nothing left but bones and hatred. And when that happens, Father, I'll become something much worse than I am now. Something that hunts the living instead of the dead. Father Vasquez looked around his empty church, at the flickering candles and faded saints' icons. He had sworn an oath to provide spiritual comfort to those who sought it. But did that oath extend to the dead? Very well, he said finally. Make your confession. What followed was the most horrifying hour of Father Vasquez's life. Michael described each of his kills in graphic detail. The way the undead screamed when iron pierced their corrupted flesh. The satisfaction he felt as their stolen life force dispersed back into the ether. The growing addiction to the violence that had consumed him. He spoke of Martha Hendricks, an elderly woman who had died in her sleep but returned to drain the vitality from her unsuspecting grandchildren during family visits. Michael had cornered her in the church cemetery and staked her to the ground with iron fence posts. He described Thomas Wright, a factory worker who had died in an industrial accident but came back to cause accidents for his former co-workers. Michael had blessed a crowbar with holy water and beaten the creature to final death in the abandoned factory. Most disturbing was his account of the Martinez twins, 7-year-old children who had perished in the same house fire as their mother. They had returned as innocent-looking but predatory beings, luring other children to lonely places to steal their life force. Michael had hunted them through the ruins of their burned home and destroyed them with blessed iron railroad spikes. The worst part, Father, Michael said as his confession wound down, is that I never felt guilty about any of it. Even now, describing it to you, I feel proud. These creatures were abominations, violations of God's natural order. I was doing holy work. Father Vasquez sat in stunned silence. If even half of what Michael described was true, then Riverside Falls was infected with something far worse than urban decay. But here's what troubles me most, Michael continued. As I hunted them, I began to realize something. They weren't just random resurrections. They were all connected somehow. All their deaths, all their returns, there was a pattern. What kind of pattern? They all died within a 5-mile radius of this church, Father. And they all had one thing in common. They had all confessed their darkest sins to you in the months before their deaths. Father Vasquez's blood turned to ice. Martha Hendricks confessed to slowly poisoning her husband 3 months before her natural death. Thomas Wright confessed to sabotaging safety equipment at the factory, causing the accident that killed 3 of his co-workers. The Martinez family, Sarah confessed to starting that house fire intentionally to collect the insurance money. She just didn't plan on her children being home. Michael leaned closer, his rotting face inches from the priest's. Tell me, Father, what did you do with those confessions? Because I've been thinking about it for 3 days. And I've come to a disturbing conclusion. Father Vasquez tried to speak but found his voice had abandoned him. You didn't just hear their sins, did you? You absorbed them, fed on them, used them somehow. Michael's eyes gleamed with terrible understanding. That's why they came back wrong. That's why they returned as twisted, hungry things. Because something had already claimed their souls. That's impossible, Father Vasquez whispered. Is it? Michael stood up, his dead joints creaking audibly. How long have you been alone in this church, Father? How long since the last time you felt truly alive? When did you start to change? Father Vasquez thought back over the years. The gradual decline in his congregation. The way people seemed uncomfortable around him lately. The fact that he hadn't needed to eat in weeks, sustaining himself on something else entirely. I've been watching you, Father. Following you. Do you know what you smell like? You smell like all of them. Like Martha's poison. Like Thomas's sabotage. Like Sarah's flames. You're not just a priest anymore. You're something that wears the shape of a priest. Michael smiled his rotting smile. And now, I understand why I really came back. Not for absolution. That was just what I told myself. I came back to finish my holy work. To destroy the thing that created all those abominations in the first place. Father Vasquez felt his facade cracking, his human appearance beginning to slip. You can't kill me here. This is consecrated ground. Oh, Father, Michael said, producing an iron crucifix that gleamed with holy water. Don't you remember? You haven't been able to truly consecrate anything for years. This place stopped being holy the day you started feeding on confessions. It's just an empty building now, full of stolen sins and borrowed time. The last thing Father Vasquez saw was the blessed iron cross descending toward his heart. As it pierced his chest, he felt 17 different deaths, 17 different sins, all flowing out of him like poison from a wound. In his final moments, he remembered what he had once been, a good man, a faithful priest, someone who truly wanted to help others. The transformation had been so gradual he hadn't even noticed it happening. One confession at a time, one sin at a time, until there was nothing left of Father Antonio Vasquez, except hunger and hollow faith. Michael stood over the rapidly decomposing form that had once masqueraded as a priest. Already, he could feel his own corruption beginning to heal, his purpose fulfilled. Maybe now he could find true rest. But as he prepared to leave Our Lady of Sorrows forever, he heard a sound that made his dead heart skip a beat. The heavy wooden doors creaking open and footsteps echoing through the nave. "Father," called a desperate voice, "please, I need to make confession." Michael turned to see another figure silhouetted in the doorway, and he realized with growing horror that his work in Riverside Falls was far from over. The cycle was beginning again, and there were still so many sins left to cleanse. He picked up the blessed iron cross and walked toward the newcomer, his rotting lips forming a gentle, priestly smile. "Of course, my child," he said. "But first, tell me, when was your last confession?"